Ether drifts first thin, sweet, and strangely elegant, like a perfume that doesn't belong in polite society. It seeps through drawing rooms where velvet drapes are always drawn too tightly, where pallid faces glow beneath lamplight, and where whispers carry faster than truth. In these quiet chambers, the most respectable families of Victorian Britain hid a secret far more intoxicating than scandal, a clear, volatile liquid that promised courage, clarity, and escape at the cost of everything else. It began as a medical marvel, something doctors praised, chemists bottled, and matrons kept tucked away beside their smelling salts. But for the elites who feared neither law nor moral judgment, ether became an unseen companion. A drop to steady the nerves before stepping onto a ballroom floor, a sip to dull the emptiness of a carefully curated life, and eventually, a necessity one more swallow to chase away the shadows forming behind the eyes. What no one dared admit was the truth. This genteel addiction spread faster than gossip, unraveling reputations, fortunes, and families in silence. Behind every polished carriage window and every lace-gloved hand lay a tremor, a craving, a secret no amount of etiquette could hide forever. Subscribe and stay with me. The fog thickens, the lamps dim, and the truth of Victorian society only grows stranger as we descend. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past may be distant, but its vices still breathe beneath the lamplight. The sweetness drifted long before anyone admitted it was there. It curled through the drawing room like the ghost of a forgotten perfume, slipping between brocade drapes and pooling in the corners where the lamplight could not quite reach. On this particular evening, the gas lamps hissed against the wallpaper, soft, steady, obedient, yet their glow seemed strangely dim, as if the air itself were growing thick. The scent was faint, but unmistakable. Sharp, shimmering, deceptively clean, not the floral powder of ladies' gloves, nor the warm musk of cigars, but something brighter, colder, and far more dangerous. It was ether, and though no one dared name it aloud, every guest felt its arrival on their tongue. Lady Ashcombe stood nearest the window, her profile lined in pale gold as she lifted her fan with a trembling hand. Anyone who knew her well, or who watched closely enough, would notice the tiny pulse at her temple, the quick flush beneath her powdered cheeks. A sheen of perspiration gathered at her collarbone, hidden beneath lace and pearls. She breathed shallowly, delicately, like a bird that had flown too far and too fast. And yet she smiled, always smiling, as if warmth could disguise the faint tremor running through her gloved fingers. Beside her, the gentlemen spoke in low, confident murmurs, discussing investments, pending legislation, and the forthcoming opera season. Their voices rolled smoothly over polished wood and velvet upholstery, but their eyes were too bright, their laughter too sharp. The same sweetness clung to them, carried in the fibers of their coats and in the faint gloss along the rims of their glass tumblers. A few minutes earlier, just long enough for a carriage to pull discreetly around to the servants' entrance, each of these men had excused himself with a polite nod and returned wearing a slightly altered expression, a bit looser in the shoulders, a bit lighter behind the eyes, a bit more invincible. No one questioned it. In such circles, addiction was never called by its name. At the far end of the room, a footman moved silently between clusters of guests, refilling glasses with wine meant to appear untouched. He knew the sharp smell that hung lightly in the air. He had smelled it on coats tossed carelessly across chaise lounges and on breath that drifted across the hallway as ladies steadied themselves on his arm. He also knew better than to speak of it. Servants were expected to notice everything and mention nothing, so he lowered his gaze, placed another untouched goblet on a silver tray, and drifted away like a shadow that did not wish to be seen. Lady Ashcombe exhaled softly and touched her fingertips to the small bottle hidden within her embroidered reticule. She could feel its chill even through the fabric. She told herself she merely needed a moment's comfort, a breath, a drop, the smallest taste of calm, just enough to silence the dull ache growing behind her eyes, just enough to smooth over the emptiness that had been settling day by day beneath her ribs. It was not weakness, she insisted silently. It was refinement. The world expected composure from her, even perfection. Surely it was no crime to borrow a bit of steadiness from a scent that glistened like bottled starlight. Across the room, the orchestra's distant preparation floated through the corridor, the faint plinking of strings being tuned, the soft hum of a vocalist warming her throat. Guests straightened their posture, prepared to descend to the ballroom, and adjusted their jewels in the mirrored surface of glass-topped tables. Yet beneath the elegance, beneath the silk and the satin, beneath the polished civility of Victorian superiority, something else stirred. Jittery, restless, hungry, the sweetness grew stronger. A gentleman stumbled slightly as he reached for his cane. A lady laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't particularly amusing. Another swayed when she stood, gripping the back of a settee a moment longer than propriety allowed. Ether threaded itself through all of it, glistening in every breath and lingering behind every polite exchange. It was invisible, but it was everywhere. And as the room prepared to move toward the brightness of the ballroom, Lady Ashcombe slipped her fingers once more around the glass vial, hidden in her purse, and felt, with a mix of dread and relief, that she needed it more tonight than she had the night before. The lamplight flickered. The air shimmered. The descent had already begun. The little chemist's shop on Brimwell Street looked harmless enough, almost quaint, in the way its windows bowed outward like an old man's chest, and its brass bell chimed with an unexpectedly cheerful ring. A passerby might admire the polished bottles displayed in the window, their amber glass catching the afternoon sun like captured warmth. They might even step inside for a tonic or a parcel of smelling salts. And yet, for all its domestic charm, the shop possessed an undercurrent of quiet danger, one detectable only to those who knew what to look for. Mr. Harrowby, the chemist, was a slender man with a greying moustache and impeccably neat waistcoat. His hands were steady, always steady, even when the customers were not. He arranged his wares with ritualistic precision. Laudanum here, carbolic acid there, liniments on the far right, and, on a shelf slightly out of reach, the bottles no one acknowledged but everyone desired, the ones with corks dipped in wax and labels written in the chemist's own careful script, the bottles that gleamed with a clarity beyond water, ether. He kept them in full view, and yet out of question, a paradox befitting Victorian sensibilities where impropriety was never forbidden, simply never spoken of. The bell above the door gave its delicate chime as Lady Ashcombe entered, her steps too quiet, her posture too perfect. Her veil was lowered just enough to obscure her expression, though nothing could hide the faint tension clinging to her shoulders. Mr. Harrowby did not greet her with surprise. She was, after all, one of his most regular visitors. "Good afternoon, my lady," he said, inclining his head. His tone carried the polished neutrality of a man who made it his life's business not to know more than he ought. A headache remedy today, perhaps? Her gloved hands hovered near the polished counter. "Yes," she murmured, "the same formulation as before." Mr. Harrowby nodded with serene professionalism. He did not mention that she had visited 3 times this week. He did not comment on the tremor in her fingertips or the slight quickening of her breath. He simply turned, retrieved the bottle from the high shelf, and wrapped it neatly in paper, as though it contained nothing more extraordinary than cough syrup. His discretion was legendary. Some whispered that he had once been a physician, cast out for reasons no one dared discuss. Others said he had inherited the shop from his late father and understood more about society's shadows than he let on. Whatever the truth, his silence was worth more to his customers than any remedy he sold. As Lady Ashcombe slid the coins across the counter, Mr. Harrowby's eyes flickered not with judgment, but with a faint, knowing sadness. He had seen the same look before in countless other patrons: desperation dressed in silk, hope disguised as habit, the unmistakable sheen of dependence beginning to bloom behind the eyes. "Do take care, my lady," he said softly, as she tucked the small parcel into her reticule. "These formulations are to be used sparingly." She stiffened, her pride prickling. Of course, they both knew it was a lie. When she exited, the bell chimed once more, and the afternoon light spilled briefly across the shelves, illuminating the rows of glass bottles like a miniature constellation. Mr. Harrowby exhaled, long and slow, and began wiping down the counter, though no dust had settled there. Moments later, another figure entered, a gentleman this time, hat pulled low, collar turned up. He did not remove his gloves. His voice was low, urgent, barely above a whisper. "The usual." Mr. Harrowby obliged. Throughout the day the bell never stopped. Aristocrats, merchants, governesses, even a judge's wife came through, each with a rehearsed excuse. Some asked for cough tonics. Others mentioned sleeplessness. A few offered no explanation at all. Every one of them left with the same telltale shape, wrapped discreetly in brown paper. By dusk, the chemist extinguished his lamps and bolted the door behind him. The bottles gleamed faintly in the dark, silent witnesses to a growing hunger that stretched far beyond the shop walls. Mr. Harrowby paused once before descending to his cellar, touching one of the wax-sealed vials lightly with a fingertip. He never tasted ether himself, but he knew the scent, he knew the ruin, and he knew far better than his customers that no amount of silence could keep what was coming from finding them all. In the shadows of Victorian society, the chemist's shop had become the first unmarked gate on a very long descent. The Ashcombe carriage rattled softly along the cobbled street, its lacquered panels reflecting the gas lamps that glowed like watchful eyes. Inside, Lady Ashcombe sat perfectly upright, her gown a cascade of ivory silk that shimmered whenever the carriage tilted. The night's ball at Harrington House promised elegance, waltzes, and the usual parade of grand illusions, but all she could feel was the faint tightening in her chest, the breath that would not quite come, the tremor that whispered beneath her gloves. Her maid, Clara, sat across from her, hands folded neatly atop her lap. She kept her gaze low, as all good servants were taught, yet she noticed everything: the too quick rise and fall of her mistress's breath, the slight sheen above her brow, the restless shift of gloved fingers as they brushed again and again against the reticule that rested beside her. Inside that delicate embroidered purse was the one thing Lady Ashcombe trusted more than her reputation: ether. Not much, just a vial, just enough. The carriage slowed as it approached the grand steps of Harrington House, where golden light spilled from the entrance and orchestral tones drifted outward like warm breath. Laughter rang through the open doors, accompanied by glimpses of diamonds and silk swirling beneath gilt chandeliers. The world expected Lady Ashcombe to glide effortlessly into this brilliance, but her heart skittered like a trapped bird. "Clara," she murmured softly, pressing her hand against the reticule. "A moment." Clara hesitated. "My lady, we have arrived." "Yes," Lady Ashcombe replied, though her voice trembled almost imperceptibly. "A moment." The maid understood. She lowered her eyes and shifted her body to block view from the carriage window. With practiced motions far too practiced for something meant to be occasional, Lady Ashcombe slid the vial into her palm. The cork came free with a gentle pop, releasing that familiar, shimmering sweetness. It drifted upward, mingling with the scent of her perfume, until the two became indistinguishable. She tilted the vial. A drop touched her hand, then another. She brought her gloved fingertips to her lips, inhaling deeply. The ether's cold sting raced down her throat and into her lungs like a line of quicksilver. Relief washed over her. Her vision steadied. The tremor faded. The hollow ache inside her chest softened, melting beneath a warmth that was neither natural nor earned. Ether wrapped itself around her like a velvet mantle, weightless, comforting, promising composure where fragility once stood. She corked the vial and slipped it back into her purse. Clara pretended not to hear the faint click as it settled into place. "Thank you," Lady Ashcombe whispered. The carriage door opened. A liveried footman extended his hand. She descended with perfect grace, the picture of poise. The ether was working quickly now, her steps light, her smile smooth, her thoughts unclouded by doubt. She glimmered beneath the lanterns as she crossed the threshold into Harrington House, where dozens of admiring faces turned her way. "She looks radiant this evening," one woman whispered behind her fan. "Astonishingly so," another agreed. Lady Ashcombe glided forward as though floating above the polished floor, accepting compliments with a flourish, laughing at just the right pitch, engaging in conversation without hesitation. To any observer, she appeared untouched by worry or weariness. No one saw how tightly she held her purse. The ballroom spun with colour turquoise gowns, crimson silk, gold braiding, yet everything felt distant, softened by the ether's gentle haze. Lady Ashcombe danced, conversed, charmed, her movements perfectly timed to the orchestra's rhythm. For a moment, every part of her life was illuminated, flawless, enviable. But as the night wore on, a subtle shift crept in. Her laughter became too bright. Her footsteps grew too quick. The music, once soothing, now pressed against her ears with unnerving persistence. Somewhere behind the glittering facade, the sweetness in her lungs began to sour. She pressed a hand briefly to her side, steadying her breath. One drop before the ball had been enough. Until it wasn't, and as Lady Ashcombe twirled beneath the crystal chandeliers, clasped in the arms of admirers who praised her beauty and brilliance, she felt just for an instant the faintest curl of dread beneath her ribs. The night was only beginning, and so was the hunger. The smoking room at Harrington House was a sanctuary of masculine privilege, walnut-panelled walls, deep leather chairs, and a haze of cigar smoke that curled lazily beneath the mounted stag heads. It was a room built for confidences, for laughter pitched too low for the ladies' ears, for the soft clink of glasses raised in camaraderie. Yet beneath the polished veneer, the room hummed with an energy far sharper than tobacco or brandy could explain. Within its shadowed corners lay the true secret of the evening. Lord Pembroke, a man whose waistcoat strained slightly from indulgence and whose silver hair was combed with military precision, lounged in the grandest chair by the fire. His cheeks already carried a flush too vivid for brandy alone. In his gloved hand, he held a small silver flask engraved with ivy vines, an heirloom, he claimed, though none believed him. The flask gleamed in the firelight, reflecting flames like a wink of mischief. As the door closed behind the last of the entering guests, Pembroke raised the flask with an exaggerated flourish. "Gentlemen," he murmured, "a little something to warm the spirit." The others laughed, eager, familiar, hungry. Colonel Fairfax, lean and hawk-eyed, extended his hand first. He was a man accustomed to control, whether on horseback or in Parliament, but tonight his composure had cracks that only a trained observer would see. His fingers quivered as he unscrewed the top, releasing a sweet, chemical scent that floated through the room like the whisper of a forbidden promise. Ether. He took a quick sip, small, scarcely more than a swallow, and exhaled sharply as its icy burn slid down his throat. His pupils dilated, his posture softened. A heat bloomed across his face, replacing the stiffness in his jaw with something almost giddy. "Marvellous," Fairfax muttered, handing it off. One by one, the flask passed between them. Barristers, officers, noblemen, who had spent years cultivating an image of restraint. Yet here, behind walnut doors and thick velvet drapes, they abandoned the etiquette they performed so skillfully in public. Their laughter grew louder, their gestures wider. Their conversations, initially crisp and dignified, began to unravel into overlapping boasts and confessions, delivered with whispered urgency. Mr. Alderton, newly appointed to the Bank of England, leaned too close to Fairfax, tapping his temple with one unsteady finger. "It clears the mind, you know," he insisted. "Sends the thoughts running like racehorses." "Until they collapse at the finish line," muttered Pembroke, though he was already reaching for the flask again. No one noticed how his hand shook. Outside the closed doors, the orchestra played a waltz that flowed through the corridors like liquid gold. The distant swell of voices, ladies gossiping, dancers laughing, filtered faintly into the smoking room. Yet the men felt insulated, cocooned, emboldened by the ether's sweet lift. The constraints of rank and reputation loosened with every mouthful. "Did you hear about Ashcombe?" one man ventured. Fairfax chuckled. "Ashcombe? Half our circle is a hair's breadth from collapse, but you didn't hear that from me." Their laughter echoed, careless and strange. But the room was not blind. Not entirely. A younger man, Mr. Townsend, barely 25 and still earnest in his ambitions, sat quiet in the corner, observing the others with the rigid posture of someone who recognized danger too late. He had taken a sip, only one, and already a warmth had spread through him, blurring the edges of the room. He wanted to stand, to speak, to breathe deeply, but the air felt weighted, thickened by the sweet chemical musk. He understood then why the older men returned to this silver flask so often. For a moment, everything inside him felt bright, almost brilliant. His fears about his career, his debts, his family all softened beneath the ether's glow. But he also sensed something else. Behind the laughter, beneath the bravado, there pulsed a subtle desperation. These men were not simply indulging, they were clinging to composure, clinging to youth, clinging to a world where the demands of their rank were crushing, relentless, impossible. The flask completed its circle. Another round, another burn of sweetness, another swell of warmth. When a footman finally knocked to announce that the next dance was beginning, the men jolted back to themselves, straightening coats, smoothing hair, pretending they were as steady as the marble floors they would soon cross. Their faces flushed, their smiles a shade too bright. They left the room one by one, emerging into the glittering ballroom as if reborn. No one saw the flask slip back into Pembroke's pocket. No one smelled the ether that lingered in the air, faint as a ghost. And no one suspected that beneath the refinement of Harrington House, the most powerful men of Victorian society were already unravelling one silver sip at a time. The balls of Harrington House always ended the same way, with a soft flurry of silk at the staircase, a chorus of goodbyes drifting through the winter air, and a procession of carriages lined neatly beneath the gas lamps, like obedient horses waiting to be claimed. On most nights, the departure took no more than 15 minutes, elegant ladies tucked into plush interiors, gentlemen giving final bows before vanishing into the night. But on this particular evening, something unusual happened. The carriages did not leave. They lingered. Their lanterns glowed through the fog, their horses stamped in impatience, and their drivers sat stiffly atop their seats, glancing toward the mansion with growing unease. The first 10 minutes passed without concern. After 20 minutes, they exchanged questioning looks. By 30 minutes, the line of carriages had barely moved an inch. For inside the house, the guests were delayed for reasons no one dared name. Lady Ashcombe was one of the first to falter. Her steps, graceful at the start of the evening, grew increasingly unsure as she crossed the marble foyer. The warmth of ether still lingered in her system, but now it tugged at her senses rather than lifting them. The ornate lamps blurred at their edges. The chatter of departing guests buzzed too loudly in her ears. Her gloved hand brushed the wall for support. "Are you quite well, my lady?" asked Clara, who had been summoned to escort her mistress to the carriage. Lady Ashcombe smiled too widely, too suddenly. "Perfectly," she whispered, though her pupils were dark and blown with the remnants of intoxication. Beside her, Colonel Fairfax struggled to maintain his posture. The ether he had sipped in the smoking room left a faint sheen of sweat along his brow. He blinked rapidly, as though the world had become slightly tilted. His cane tapped the floor twice before he steadied himself. Lord Pembroke, red-cheeked and jovial in his stupor, was not so fortunate. When he reached the bottom of the staircase, he nearly stumbled into a marble pedestal bearing a Grecian urn. A footman rushed forward, catching him before disaster struck. Pembroke chuckled, brushing the incident aside. "Carpet's uneven," he muttered. The carpet was flawless. More guests filtered toward the entrance, moving with the uncertain steps of sleepwalkers. Their laughter, normally light and poised, carried an odd, wavering pitch. Hats were fumbled with, shawls dropped, gloves misplaced. One woman paused mid-sentence, staring blankly ahead for several seconds before remembering she was supposed to speak. The servants noticed first, though they would never say so aloud. They exchanged glances as they assisted their employers, sensing something was wrong beneath the polished veneer. They had been trained to anticipate the needs of their household, but tonight their instincts whispered caution. A gentleman leaned heavily against a footman as he whispered, "My coat, no, not that one. The other, though there was only one coat in the man's possession." Another guest clutched the banister with whitening knuckles, breathing shallowly as she descended. She murmured about the air being too thin, the lamps too bright, the floor shifting beneath her feet, complaints that made no sense in the stable, unchanging foyer. By the time the guests stepped outside, the cold air struck them like an unexpected wave. The fog swirled around their faces, making the ground seem unsteady. Horses snorted and pulled at their reins, as though startled by the strange scent wafting from the departing crowd. Lady Ashcombe clutched Clara's arm as she approached her carriage. "Just a moment," she breathed, closing her eyes. The night spun gently, like a waltz she could not escape. Across the steps, Pembroke paused before entering his carriage, gripping the doorframe as he steadied himself. Fairfax stood beside him, pretending to adjust his gloves while fighting the urge to sit on the cold stone steps. The line of carriages shifted impatiently, but none departed. Their occupants lingered inside for several long minutes, some slumped back in their seats, others fanning themselves desperately, still others asking their drivers to wait, just wait, until the room stopped turning. A few insisted they had forgotten something inside, only to realize they did not remember what. The drivers exchanged uneasy glances. They were accustomed to secrets, accustomed to late-night whispers and mischief, but this was different. This was collective, unnatural, a night where too many of London's finest were not quite themselves. Slowly, too slowly, the first carriage creaked forward, the horses stepping gingerly into the fog. One by one, the rest followed, their wheels cracking against the street in hesitant rhythm. The night swallowed them. But the drivers would remember years later, long after the scandal crystallized in whispered retellings, that on that strange winter night, the carriages of the elite had stayed too long outside Harrington House, and every one of those passengers had looked just a little pale, a little shaken, a little hollow-eyed, as though they had left something of themselves behind in the ballroom. The servants' stairs at Ashcombe Manor were narrow, dimly lit, and steep enough to humble even the proudest guest, though no guest ever set foot on them. These were the hidden arteries of the house, where footsteps went unheard and secrets slipped quietly between the walls. And moving through them with practiced grace was Clara Whitlow, housemaid to Lady Ashcombe, watcher of all that society preferred to ignore. Clara had long ago learned that observing was safer than speaking. A maid who noticed too much could lose her place, but one who noticed just enough, just silently enough, could keep a household from crumbling. Or so she told herself as she rose before dawn each morning to polish mirrors, straighten gowns, and fold linens, still carrying traces of last night's perfumes and darker things besides. But lately, the manner had changed. Little signs at first. harmless, if only taken one at a time. A lace glove left on the dressing table with a faint chemical scent beneath the perfume. A crystal vial tucked too hastily beneath a pillow. The mistress's morning teacup trembling slightly in her hand, though she insisted she was perfectly well. Clara had tried to explain these things away, but the clues multiplied, collecting like dust along the baseboards, easy to overlook, impossible to ignore. It was the missing bottle that first made Clara certain. She remembered placing it on the vanity one morning. Clear glass, pear-shaped, sealed with wax. Her mistress had insisted it be left out, claiming it as a medicinal tonic for her nerves. Clara thought nothing of it at the time. Ladies had all sorts of odd remedies, lavender tinctures, camphor drops, violet syrups, but this vial had smelled nothing like flowers or herbs. It smelled sharp, bright, cold. Ether. By evening, the vial had vanished. Clara found the cork tucked beneath the edge of the rug, as though dropped in haste. A faint ring of liquid had dried on the vanity's surface, leaving a ghostly residue that glittered under lamplight. The next morning, Lady Ashcombe rose late, far later than usual. Clara entered the bedroom quietly, carrying a tray of tea and lightly toasted bread. The mistress sat at her mirror, brushing powder onto cheeks that looked paler than porcelain. "You needn't stare, Clara," she murmured, eyes fixed on her own reflection. "I wasn't staring, my lady." But she had been. She couldn't help it. The brush trembled faintly in Lady Ashcombe's hand. Her pupils were still wide, her breathing unsteady, her movements too deliberate, as though she had to think through each one before performing it. Clara placed the tray down. "Shall I open the curtains?" "No, leave them." The mistress's voice came too quickly, too tightly. Clara paused. "Of course, my lady." She withdrew, though her heart remained uneasy. In the servants' hall below, the other maids whispered. They always whispered, but now they whispered about Clara's mistress, about the carriages lingering too long after the Harrington ball, about the gentleman who stumbled down the steps, about the strange scent drifting through the foyer that night. Servants noticed everything. It was their curse. Later that week, Clara discovered another clue. A handkerchief crumpled behind a chaise, marked with a small circular stain that smelled unmistakably of ether. She pressed it to her nose, recoiled, then tucked it discreetly into her apron pocket. She didn't know why she kept it, perhaps to remind herself she hadn't imagined anything. That evening, as Clara prepared her mistress for dinner, Lady Ashcombe's hands shook badly enough that a pearl earring nearly slipped from her grasp. "My lady," Clara said softly, stepping forward, "may I help?" Her mistress froze. For one fragile moment, the facade cracked. Lady Ashcombe looked up at Clara, really looked at her with eyes full of exhaustion and something close to fear. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. "That won't be necessary." But Clara had seen, and now she knew too much to pretend otherwise. As she watched her mistress glide down the staircase toward the dining room, posture perfect, smile flawless, Clara felt a cold certainty settle deep within her ribs. Lady Ashcombe was unraveling, and Clara, the housemaid who noticed everything, would bear witness to every quiet tremor, every strained breath, every whisper of ether that seeped through the manor like a sweet, poisonous ghost. It was the kind of secret a household never recovered from. Dr. Harriman Finch had the sort of face one trusted, instinctively calm, composed, and framed by a pair of spectacles that reflected lamplight like small, polite moons. His consulting room smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic, and the walls were lined with tall shelves bearing medicinal bottles arranged with almost ceremonial symmetry. The brass instruments on his desk gleamed beneath the soft gas lamps. Everything about the room whispered competence. Everything about the man whispered reassurance, which is precisely why Lady Ashcombe found herself seated across from him on a mild winter afternoon, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her features composed just enough to disguise the storm beneath. "Your nerves again, Lady Ashcombe?" Dr. Finch asked gently, flipping through her notes as though paging through a familiar novel. "My nerves," she echoed, forcing a delicate smile. He looked up, his eyes soft with practiced concern. "They trouble more ladies than you might believe. The pressures of society weigh heavily on the most refined dispositions." The compliment washed over her like warm tea. Dr. Finch had a gift for making ailments feel elegant. Still, Clara's watchful eyes had unsettled her, the whispers among the servants, the tremors she could no longer hide, the cold, sudden panic that seized her without warning. For a fleeting moment that morning, she had seen herself in the mirror and felt as though she were staring at a stranger, eyes too bright, cheeks too pale, a sweetness clinging to her breath. She needed reassurance, needed someone to tell her it was all nothing, needed her secret confirmed as harmless. Dr. Finch closed the file and leaned back, folding his hands. "Tell me, my lady, what symptoms concern you most today?" She hesitated. The fluttering. "Here." She pressed lightly at her sternum. "Yes," he murmured. "That is quite common." "And the tremor," she whispered. "It comes and goes." "Nerves," he said soothingly. Her breath hitched. "And the hallucinations?" He only smiled. "Exhaustion, overstimulation." His voice was velvet, his smile unwavering. "And the tonic," she ventured. "The ether. It helps, does it not?" Dr. Finch's expression remained perfectly serene, though his eyes flicked just for a moment to the wax-sealed bottle resting in the paper bag she carried. "Helps?" he repeated. "My dear Lady Ashcombe, it is prescribed precisely because it helps." She exhaled, relief blooming across her features. "Then I may continue taking it?" "Of course," he said warmly. "In moderation. Always in moderation." He said it the way a priest might say "Amen" at the end of a confession. She did not notice how perfunctory his warning was, nor did she notice how swiftly he wrote the new prescription, his quill dancing across the parchment with the fluid ease of someone who had written it many times before. The script was elegant, the instructions vague, the dose generous. "Ether is not dangerous when used responsibly," he continued. "It calms the mind. It steadies the breath. Why, I prescribe it to half the ladies in Mayfair." This was meant to comfort her. It did. She knew his reputation, physician to the affluent, the entrusted keeper of delicate conditions and discreet remedies. Rumour whispered that his waiting room was often filled with aristocratic wives whose husbands believed they were merely resting upstairs or recovering from a headache. A man whose livelihood depended upon keeping society soothed, calmed, and unfailingly functional. "Your troubles," he added gently, "are symptoms of a sensitive constitution, not a moral failing." Her eyes shimmered with gratitude. Dr. Finch rose and handed her the envelope containing the prescription. "Take this to Mr. Harrowby. He'll prepare the bottle himself." She nodded, rising to leave, her pulse steadier already not from the doctor's words, but from the promise of what awaited at the chemist's shop. "Lady Ashcombe," the doctor added as she reached the door. She paused. "If the trembling worsens," he said with a kind smile, "simply increase the dose before bed. It will help you sleep." His tone was soft, reassuring, almost paternal. She bowed her head in thanks and slipped out into the corridor. The door closed behind her with a quiet, definitive click. Only then did Dr. Finch's smile fade. He returned to his desk, fingers brushing the open drawer where half a dozen identical prescriptions sat neatly stacked. Ether for nerves, ether for sorrow, ether for loneliness, ether for ladies who needed to appear serene in rooms full of judgment. He sighed softly, removing his spectacles and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The line between remedy and ruin was growing thinner, and the city's most respected physician was quietly walking his patients straight across it, one calming dose at a time. The Royal Opera House glowed like a jeweled lantern against the London night, its grand facade shimmering through the rising fog. Inside, crystal chandeliers spilled golden light upon brocade chairs, gilded balconies, and tiers of velvet curtains drawn back in theatrical invitation. It was an evening of spectacle arias drifting like silk through the air, violins lifting in luminous strands, and the audience arranged in immaculate rows, every face carefully composed. But beneath the composure lay something else entirely. As Lady Ashcombe stepped into her private box, the familiar sweetness brushed the edge of her senses. Not perfume, not powder, ether. A faint, glittering trace, woven into the crowd like an uninvited melody. She inhaled shallowly, her gloved hand steadying itself on the velvet railing. Clara followed behind her, adjusting her mistress's wrap with the quiet diligence expected of a lady's maid. Yet her eyes flicked, searching, noticing. "Are you comfortable, my lady?" Clara asked softly. "Yes," Lady Ashcombe murmured. "Quite." But Clara saw the truth, a quickening pulse beneath the pearls, a brightness in the eyes that was not entirely natural. The dose taken before leaving the house had steadied her mistress's nerves just enough. Too much more, however, and even the chandelier's gentle shimmer would feel like an assault upon the senses. The orchestra began, a rich swell of strings that rolled across the hall. The audience shifted in a synchronized rustle. Fans fluttered, opera glasses clicked open. Yet, instead of leaning into the performance, people leaned into each other, hushed voices slipping between notes, secrets disguised as commentary. "Did you hear about Lady Pembroke?" someone whispered from the next box. "Collapsed after supper. Doctor says nerves, but well." A soft intake of breath. "They say her husband keeps a flask." Clara's gaze sharpened, though she kept her face still. Lady Ashcombe stiffened, as if the whisper had reached her skin. In the pit below, a gentleman fumbled his opera glasses, nearly dropping them before catching them with trembling fingers. His companion laid a hand on his arm, steadying him, or warning him, or both. Another woman dabbed her forehead repeatedly with a lace handkerchief. Though the theatre was cool, the air crisp with winter damp. The whispers continued, rising and falling like the tremulous overture. "Mrs. Wexley fainted in her carriage last night, same sweet smell about her." Lord Scarborough missed a speech in Parliament. "Too ill to attend," they said, but servants heard he couldn't even stand. Several young ladies have refused invitations since the Harrington ball. Their mothers claim they are simply fatigued. All spoken with the hushed excitement of gossip, yet beneath it pulsed unmistakable fear. Lady Ashcombe pressed her gloved fingers to her temple. The soprano's voice struck a high, crystalline note that reverberated through the hall. Beautiful, yes, but too sharp, too pointed. For a moment, the sound fractured around her like glass under strain. Clara saw her mistress sway ever so slightly. "My lady," she whispered urgently. "I'm fine," Lady Ashcombe insisted, though the world shimmered at the edges. A gentleman in the row below stood abruptly, knocking over his program as he hurried out of the box. His wife watched him go, her expression caught between embarrassment and dread. The scent of ether trailed faintly behind him, sharp enough that even Clara caught it. Moments later, another couple slipped away, and another. The opera continued, the singers pouring their souls into the stage's golden glow. But the audience faltered. Whispers replaced applause. Eyes darted nervously from face to face. What should have been a night of elegance began to feel like a room full of delicate porcelain, each piece painted beautifully, each one threatening to crack. Lady Ashcombe leaned forward, gripping the velvet railing as if to steady herself. The chandelier's crystals pulsed in her vision, her breath hitched, shallow and rapid. Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "My lady, perhaps we should—" "No," Lady Ashcombe whispered sharply. "Not yet." The performance reached its crescendo. The soprano hit a note that soared like a blade. Several guests winced. One woman dropped her fan. Somewhere in the mezzanine, someone whispered too loudly, "It's the ether. It must be." And in that moment, it seemed the entire theatre heard it. Lady Ashcombe's breath caught. Her heart lurched. The sweetness she had once welcomed now pooled thickly in her throat, souring with dread. Clara's hand found her arm. "My lady, please." But the act was ending. Applause swelled, and amid the clapping hands and trembling bodies, Lady Ashcombe realized, with a cold clarity that sliced through her haze, ether was no longer a quiet indulgence. It was a whisper spreading through London faster than any melody that had ever graced this gilded hall. A whisper no opera could drown out. The morning after the opera arrived with a pale, colourless light that seeped reluctantly through the heavy drapes of Ashcombe Manor. The fog outside had thickened overnight, wrapping the street in a woolen hush. Inside, however, the quiet was broken by a soft, uneven tapping so faint it might have been mistaken for a draught rattling against the window panes. But it was not the window. It was Lady Ashcombe's hand. She sat at her vanity, still in her dressing gown of pale rose silk, though she had been awake for hours. Her reflection in the mirror was composed at first glance. Her hair pinned neatly, her earrings set aside, her face carefully powdered. But beneath that fragile order, something trembled. Her right hand shook uncontrollably. Not a visible quake at first, but a subtle flutter like a moth trapped beneath her skin. She tried to hide it from herself, pressing the trembling hand beneath her other, smoothing her palm across the vanity table as if polishing away evidence. But the tremor persisted. Clara noticed it the moment she entered with the morning tray. "My lady," the maid said softly, "your tea." Lady Ashcombe turned her face toward the maid, but her eyes did not quite focus at first. Clara froze. The tremor was no longer subtle. The porcelain teacup rattled softly as Lady Ashcombe reached for it, her fingers tapping the china with a delicate, stuttering rhythm. Clara stepped forward quickly. "Allow me." "No," Lady Ashcombe whispered. "I can manage." She couldn't. The cup wobbled violently, and Clara caught it just before hot tea spilled across her mistress's lap. A silence followed, thin, fragile, trembling as much as Lady Ashcombe's hands. She inhaled sharply, the sweetness of last night's ether still ghosting her breath. Her pulse fluttered at her throat, a visible pulse of chaos beneath a pearl necklace. Clara set the cup aside gently. "My lady, perhaps you should lie down." "I said I am quite well," Lady Ashcombe insisted, though her voice wavered. She rose from the stool, but her legs carried the same unsteady tremor as her hands. The carpeted floor rose toward her in a dizzying tilt. Clara darted forward, catching her arm before she stumbled. "My lady." Lady Ashcombe clung to the maid's arm for balance, her breath coming in uneven bursts. "It's the lingering effects of the opera," she whispered. "The lights, the noise." But Clara knew better. She had smelled it on her mistress's breath last night. She had seen her return from the carriage with pupils widened, posture too loose, voice too bright. Ether's aftertaste lingered in more than scent, it lingered in the bones, the nerves, the pulse. Gently, Clara guided her back to the vanity stool. Lady Ashcombe placed her trembling hands in her lap and stared down at them with a mixture of confusion and dread. She tried to still them, willed them to obey. They did not. A tear, not of sadness, but of sheer frustration, gathered at the corner of her eye. She blinked it away before it could fall. "I just need a drop," she murmured under her breath, too low for Clara to hear clearly, but not low enough to hide the truth's shape. Clara stiffened. She pretended to adjust the curtains to give her mistress dignity. Behind her, she heard the faint slide of fabric, the rustle of Lady Ashcombe reaching for her reticule. "No," Clara whispered to herself. "Please, no." When she turned back, Lady Ashcombe had the small wax-sealed vial cupped in her hand. She held it close to her chest, as though it were a holy relic capable of banishing fear. Her shaking fingers struggled with the cork. "My lady," Clara said, stepping forward nervously. "Perhaps—" But Lady Ashcombe snapped. "Leave me." Her voice was sharper than Clara had ever heard, sharp enough to slice through the quiet morning like broken glass. Clara stepped back, hurt flickering in her chest, but she obeyed. She slipped from the room and closed the door softly behind her. Inside, Lady Ashcombe finally tore the cork free. The scent bloomed instantly, bright, sweet, icy. She pressed the vial to her lips, inhaling desperately. The ether's cold burn flooded her senses, drowning the tremor beneath a wave of false calm. Her breathing slowed, the shaking dulled. For a moment, just a moment, she felt restored. She exhaled shakily, allowing her shoulders to drop in relief. But the mirror before her remained unchanged. Her hands still trembled, not violently, not as before, but enough to reveal the truth. The drop no longer cured the shaking. It only hid it, for now. And as Lady Ashcombe stared into the mirror, watching the tremor ripple faintly through her fingers like the echo of an unspoken fear, she understood deep in the hollow of her chest that something had begun inside her, something she could no longer control, something that would not stop shaking. By the time dusk settled over Ashcombe Manor, the entire household had quietly agreed without speaking, without acknowledging that tonight must appear ordinary, normal, undisturbed, as though nothing had transpired that morning in the mistress's chamber, as though no tremor had rattled porcelain or shaken silk, as though the faint, nervous scent of ether did not linger in the corridors like a ghost of something no one dared name. The dinner table gleamed with its usual ceremony: polished silverware, crystal decanters filled with claret, and a centerpiece of winter roses arranged with symmetrical precision. Footmen in immaculate livery lined the edges of the room, hands clasped at their backs, gazes politely lowered. Everything from the lighting of the candles to the placement of the bread knives was perfect. Everything except the people. Lord Ashcombe took his seat at the head of the table, adjusting his waistcoat with stiff fingers. A distinguished man of 50, he had always carried himself with quiet authority, but tonight his brow furrowed more deeply than usual. He stole occasional glances toward his wife, his eyes carrying a weight he did not voice. Perhaps concern, perhaps suspicion, or perhaps something simpler: confusion at the subtle shifts in a woman he believed he knew. Lady Ashcombe entered moments later, gliding into the room with an elegance that faltered only in the smallest details. Clara walked a pace behind her, holding a candle, in case the dimming light proved troublesome. The mistress smiled gracefully, flawlessly, but beneath the smile, Clara saw the strain tightening her jaw, the slight tension at her shoulders. The tremor had diminished since morning, not vanished, never vanished, only soothed by the ether she had taken hours earlier. But the calm it provided now came with a new edge, sharper, more demanding. It no longer softened her. It held her upright like invisible strings, propping her against the quiet collapse of her own nerves. Lord Ashcombe rose politely. "My dear," he said, kissing her cheek, "you look lovely." She smiled. "Thank you." Her voice did not tremble, but her hand, as she rested it on the back of her chair, nearly did. Dinner began. Conversation flowed, or tried to. The clatter of silver against porcelain echoed louder in the silence between spoken words. The servants served each course with practiced grace: soup of leeks and cream, roast duck with orange glaze, stewed pears shimmering in wine. Yet even the warmth of the meal could not thaw the chill that ran beneath the tablecloth. "So," Lord Ashcombe ventured, clearing his throat, "the Harrington ball was quite the success. Everyone is speaking of it." Lady Ashcombe nodded, though her thoughts seemed distant. "Yes, quite." Clara watched from near the wall, her eyes following every small movement. The mistress lifted her wine glass. Her hand wavered barely, but Clara saw it. She always saw. Lord Ashcombe hesitated before speaking again. I heard there were incidents. A few guests felt faint. A pause. The room held its breath. Lady Ashcombe's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. The hall was warm, she replied simply. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual. And yet her pulse fluttered visibly at her neck. Her gaze drifted momentarily to the sideboard where her reticule rested, its shape revealing the faint outline of a small bottle concealed within. She forced herself to look away. Lord Ashcombe changed the subject, whether from politeness or fear of the answer. The conversation turned to minor matters: an acquaintance's engagement, the weather predicted for the next fortnight, a shipment of books arriving from Edinburgh. The topics floated like hollow ornaments, shining but empty. Every so often, Lady Ashcombe glanced toward the doorway, as if expecting something or someone to arrive. A subtle gesture, harmless if viewed alone. But Clara saw the deeper truth. Her mistress was counting the minutes until she could excuse herself. Not to rest, not to retire, but to steady herself, to seek the cold, glittering relief of ether. Dessert was served. Lady Ashcombe lifted a spoonful of stewed pears, then set it back down, appetite lost. Lord Ashcombe noticed, but said nothing. His brow knit once more, his silence louder than reprimand. When dinner finally concluded, Lady Ashcombe rose with familiar poise. "I believe I shall withdraw to the drawing-room," she announced. "It has been a long day." Lord Ashcombe offered her his arm. "Shall I join you?" She hesitated. Her fingers twitched. Her smile pressed too tightly into place. "Not just now," she murmured. "Perhaps later." He nodded slowly. And so the ruse continued. Lady Ashcombe swept from the room, Clara trailing behind her like a shadow carrying every truth the manor refused to see. As the drawing-room doors closed, the silence they left behind was heavy, filled with unasked questions, unspoken fears, and the quiet, collective decision of an entire household. Tonight would appear normal, even if nothing about it was. The boudoir had always been Lady Ashcombe's sanctuary, a room steeped in soft rose hues, draped in damask curtains, and scented faintly with lavender sachets tucked carefully into drawers. Here, the world's expectations seemed to melt away, absorbed by the velvet chaise and the delicate Parisian wallpaper that wrapped the room like a private cocoon. It was the one place where she allowed herself to unmask, if only for a moment. But lately, the room held something else, something sharper, something sweet, volatile, and secret. The bottle. It rested in the most unremarkable of places, tucked behind the lace handkerchiefs in her dressing-table drawer, wrapped in a fold of silk to keep it from clinking. A small glass vial sealed with wax, clear as melting ice, innocent in appearance, yet capable of rearranging her entire reality with a single breath. Lady Ashcombe had hidden jewels before brooches, lockets, even letters written by admirers she never intended to answer. But she had never hidden anything with the trembling urgency she used to hide this bottle. The need to conceal it felt as vital as the need to use it. On this particular evening, as the manor settled into its nocturnal hush, she closed the door to her boudoir and leaned back against it, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her corset felt too tight, her skin too warm. She pressed a hand to her temple. The tremor had returned. She crossed the room with hurried steps, her silk skirts brushing the rug with a whispery rustle. The drawer slid open beneath her trembling hand. For a moment, she hesitated, fear and desire circling each other in her chest like predators sharing the same cage. Then she reached inside. The chilled glass met her fingertips with an almost intimate familiarity. She closed her hand around it, her pulse quickening. The bottle's coldness soothed her in a way nothing else could, not the warmth of her bed, not the stability of her marriage, not the well-practiced mask she wore during the day. With a careful twist, she broke the seal. The The scent drifted upward at once, bright, sweet, cutting through the air like a silver thread. Her breath hitched. She lifted the vial to her lips, tilting it ever so slightly. A single drop touched her tongue, then another. The cold shimmer spread down her throat and blossomed across her chest. Her muscles softened, her heartbeat slowed into a deliberate, measured cadence. Relief, and yet something else, a heaviness, a fog around the edges of her vision, a faint unsteadiness she pretended she did not feel. She closed the drawer quickly, hiding the bottle once more beneath the silk scarf, but she lingered, hand resting atop it, as though needing its presence to steady her, as though the knowledge of its location offered her more comfort than any person in the house. She forced herself to breathe deeply. She smoothed her hair. She willed her reflection, now sitting still and pale in the vanity mirror, to look like the woman she once was, composed, elegant, unshaken. But the mirror was cruelly honest tonight. Her pupils were too wide, her lips held a faint tremor, a trace of ether shimmered faintly on her breath, like a ghost she could not exorcise. A soft knock at the door startled her. "My lady!" Clara's voice drifted through the wood, gentle, cautious. Lady Ashcombe straightened instantly. "One moment," she called, her tone light, as if she had merely been adjusting a ribbon in her hair. She swept a handkerchief across her lips, closed the drawer entirely, and glided across the room with practiced grace. When she opened the door, Clara stood there, holding a folded shawl. "You left this downstairs," the maid murmured. Lady Ashcombe accepted it with a smile too bright. "Thank you, Clara. That will be all." Clara dipped her head, though her eyes flickered just briefly to the mistress's trembling hand. When she left, Lady Ashcombe pressed her back against the closed door, the shawl slipping from her grasp and pooling on the carpet. The room swayed ever so slightly. She steadied herself on the vanity table. Behind her, the bottle slept quietly in its drawer, wrapped in silk like a dangerous jewel. And in that moment, Lady Ashcombe understood a truth she had been avoiding. The bottle was no longer something she hid. It was something that hid her from fear, from sadness, from expectation, and it would not let her go. The portrait gallery of Ashcombe Manor had long been a place of quiet reverence, a corridor where generations of smiling ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their powdered faces frozen in gentle, dignified repose. The sconces along the walls cast warm pools of light that flickered across brocade dresses, naval uniforms, and proud patriarchs, with their hands resting on the hilts of ceremonial swords. The room smelled faintly of beeswax, polish, and old velvet. It was meant to inspire continuity, legacy, bloodline. But lately, the portraits looked different. Or perhaps Lady Ashcombe did. She entered the gallery one grey afternoon, seeking solitude or distraction, though she would not admit it. Clara followed at a respectful distance, carrying a folded shawl in case the autumn chills seeped through the old stone walls. Everything echoed faintly. The soft click of Lady Ashcombe's heeled slippers, the muted rustle of silk, the quiet hum of unease Clara carried in her throat. Lady Ashcombe paused before a large painting of her husband's great-grandparents. It was a handsome portrait, an impeccably dressed couple seated before a pastoral backdrop. Yet something seemed off. The gentleman's eyes, once warm in the glow of memory, now looked sunken and strange. The lady's smile appeared brittle, stretched too thin across her powdered face. Lady Ashcombe blinked. The room swayed. "Perhaps I am overtired," she murmured, stepping back. Clara's voice floated gently from behind her. "Would you like to sit, my lady?" "No," she insisted, though her fingers twitched at her side. "No, I'm quite fine." She continued down the corridor, stopping before another painting, this one of her husband as a young boy, his mother seated beside him. The mother's eyes, once kind, now seemed hollow. Her gaze followed Lady Ashcombe too closely, as though accusing. Lady Ashcombe swallowed hard. Her heart fluttered one quick, trembling beat. The tremor in her hands began to stir again. the portraits blurred at their edges. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, but the sweet, chemical ghost of ether rose again in her throat. Even hours after her last dose, it clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. All day she had felt its lingering pull, part comfort, part curse. She opened her eyes again and gasped softly. This time, it was her own portrait that caught her attention. A recent commission, just months old, hung at the center of the gallery. Lady Ashcombe, in pale blue silk, hands folded gracefully, chin tilted slightly upward, a portrait meant to convey serenity, refinement, control. But today, the artist's brushwork betrayed something else entirely. Her eyes in the painting looked vacant, not dulled by sadness, no. This was something different, something deeper, something hollowed out. The expression seemed to whisper that something inside her had already eroded, leaving only the shell of a woman who smiled out of habit, not joy. Lady Ashcombe took a step backward. "That cannot be," she whispered. Clara rushed forward. "My lady?" But Lady Ashcombe raised a trembling finger toward the painting. "Do you see it?" she asked. "My eyes, they look wrong." Clara stared quietly. To her, the portrait looked exactly as it always had, but she did not say so. Instead, she answered carefully, "What troubles you about it, my lady?" Lady Ashcombe's voice cracked. "It looks as though I am not truly there, as though the painter captured only the surface, and beneath it there is nothing." Clara's heart tightened. She had noticed her mistress's pallor, her sudden moments of disorientation, the way shadows gathered beneath her eyes no powder could fully conceal. But to hear Lady Ashcombe speak of it, that was new. "Perhaps we could step outside for some air," Clara offered softly. But Lady Ashcombe did not move. She remained rooted to the spot, staring at the portrait with a horrified fascination. "I look like one of them," she whispered finally. "Like the others in this gallery. Haunted. Empty." Clara hesitated. "My lady, you are unwell. Rest will help." But Lady Ashcombe shook her head. "Rest does nothing. Rest only makes the shaking worse." Her hands trembled now, visibly. Clara reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand on her mistress's arm. "My lady," she whispered, "please allow me to call the doctor." "No," Lady Ashcombe rasped. "Not him. He will only give me more. More ether." The truth hung in the air like a dimming candle. Lady Ashcombe turned away from her portrait, pressing her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "Clara, I do not recognize myself anymore." The portraits watched silently as mistress and maid stood in the fading afternoon light. Two figures trapped between centuries of painted ghosts, and one growing, terrifying certainty. The hollow eyes in the gallery were no longer confined to the canvas. They had begun appearing in the living. The Ashcombes' winter banquet was meant to dazzle an evening of polished silver, imported wines, and polite conversation carried along the hum of a dozen chandeliers. Invitations had been sent weeks in advance, embellished with gold leaf. The cooks had worked tirelessly since dawn, and the footmen had polished the crystal so thoroughly that each glass reflected a halo of candlelight. The guests arrived cloaked in winter velvet and pearls, stepping through the doors with the soft rustle of wealth and expectation. Laughter drifted through the foyer like a practiced overture. The orchestra tuned their strings. Everything shimmered. Too much, Clara thought as she watched from the corner of the room, far too much glitter for a night where no one looked truly luminous. Lady Ashcombe stood at the center of it all, dressed in a gown of pale champagne silk that sparkled with tiny beaded constellations. Her hair had been arranged in a delicate crown of braids, pinned with gold leaves. To any outsider, she looked exquisite, radiant, almost ethereal. But Clara saw what others did not. The glow was false, the brightness hollow. Underneath the shimmer, Lady Ashcombe's skin was pale, in a way no powder could disguise. Her smile hovered dangerously close to strain, and every so often, when she thought no one watched, she touched her fingers lightly against the side of her bodice, where her reticule rested against her ribs, the ether bottle hidden inside like a second heartbeat. Lord Ashcombe, oblivious or perhaps merely hopeful, guided her from guest to guest. "My wife has outdone herself," he proclaimed proudly. "A triumph, don't you think?" Guests nodded and cooed politely, yet more than one pair of eyes flicked toward Lady Ashcombe's trembling wine-glass, toward the slight unsteadiness in her posture. "Magnificent," murmured a duchess, though she watched the mistress of the house with cautious interest. "Though she seems fatigued." "Society demands so much of us," Lady Ashcombe replied lightly, her laugh just a shade too bright. The banquet table, long enough to seat 30, glittered beneath a canopy of crystal candelabras. Gold-rimmed plates reflected flickers of flame. Exotic fruits glistened like jewels, figs, candied oranges, sugared plums. Servants moved like silent machinery through the glow. Too much glitter. Too much light. Clara felt it the moment she stepped into the dining hall, a sharpness in the air, like the room had been wound too tightly. The guests smiled, but their smiles were stretched. Their conversations danced, but stumbled over invisible edges. And under it all was the scent, faint but unmistakable. Ether, not strong enough to alarm the untrained nose. But Clara sensed it swirling subtly, the way one might sense frost creeping across a window pane. It clung to Lady Ashcombe's breath, to the silk of her gloves, to the tension beneath her ribs. The first course arrived. Lady Ashcombe lifted her spoon, but her hand quivered. Her husband reached forward instinctively. "My dear." But she steadied herself with a brittle smile. "Just a touch tired." Her spoon rattled softly against the bowl. From across the table, Lord Pembroke watched her with a familiar, uneasy understanding, one that made Clara's stomach twist. His cheeks, too, bore the flushed hue of someone who had tasted more than wine this evening. His eyes gleamed with that same unnatural brightness. He recognized the signs because he wore them. Lady Ashcombe attempted conversation, but her words drifted in and out of coherence, sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. Guests chuckled politely, pretending not to notice. When she rose to give a short welcome toast, something she handled gracefully at every banquet, her voice wobbled. The chandelier above her seemed to shimmer too brightly. She blinked repeatedly, as though it were emitting more than light, as though it were pulsing. Clara felt dread coil in her stomach. "Please," she begged silently. "Sit down, my lady, please." But Lady Ashcombe kept talking, forcing poise into each syllable. "We are honoured to host such dear friends." Her hand trembled violently around the stem of her glass. The room held its breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, Lady Ashcombe faltered. Her knee buckled, the glass tipped. A drop of wine struck the tablecloth like a drop of blood. Lord Ashcombe caught her before she fell fully, his voice tight. "My dear." The guests surged forward with concerned murmurs. Servants hurried to steady the mistress. The orchestra stopped mid-note, leaving a thin, fragile silence behind. Lady Ashcombe smiled again too quickly, too desperately. "I'm quite well," she insisted. "Merely the heat." No one believed her, but everyone pretended they did. The dinner continued, strained and stiff, the glitter on the table suddenly feeling garish, the candles too bright, the air too thick. Clara followed close behind her mistress, her pulse quickening, her heart breaking a little more with each tremor she saw. The banquet would be remembered, but not for the feast, nor the music, nor the glittering splendor. It would be remembered as the evening when Lady Ashcombe's mask cracked just enough for everyone to glimpse the truth. The shine was fading, and underneath it lay a darkness no glitter could hide. The morning fog clung heavily to Grosvenor Square. muffling the clip of carriage wheels and dimming the gleam of polished brass door knockers. London's elite stirred slowly behind their curtained windows, nursing headaches from the glittering banquet of the previous night. But none woke with as much confusion or quiet terror as Mr. Everleigh. A respected gentleman of 42, Mr. Thomas Everleigh had built his reputation on sharp intellect, impeccable manners, and a memory so precise he could recall entire passages of Cicero without a prompt. He was known for his punctual letters, his meticulously kept appointment book, and his ability to navigate London society with effortless charm. Until the morning he could not remember his own name. He sat at the breakfast table in his townhouse, staring blankly at the newspaper before him. Steam curled from a cup of tea he did not drink. The silverware gleamed beside his untouched plate. Across from him, his wife, Margaret Everleigh, continued buttering her toast, unaware of the storm gathering in her husband's eyes. At first, he thought it was ordinary fatigue. He had slept poorly, dreams dissolving into a mist he could not recapture. But when Margaret asked, "Thomas, will you be calling on Lord Ashcombe today regarding the investment?" the question hit him like a stone dropped into still water. Thomas. The name echoed in his skull, unfamiliar, foreign. His breath quickened. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Instead, a hollow terror throbbed beneath his ribs. He glanced down at his hands, long, elegant fingers that trembled faintly. He did not remember sitting, or waking, or walking to the dining room. "Thomas?" Margaret repeated, her tone sharpening. "Are you quite well?" He forced a smile. "Of course." But the voice did not sound like his own. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had witnessed his recent changes, the late-night disappearances to his study, the sharp chemical scent on his breath when he returned to bed, the way his pupils remained dilated even in lamplight. She had assumed it was stress or the quiet grief he carried since his mother's passing. She had not yet suspected ether. Mr. Everleigh reached for his tea, but the cup rattled against the saucer, betraying him. He steadied it with both hands, attempting deep breaths to calm the tremor. But with each breath came the faint, lingering taste of ether from the night before, a sweetness he had grown to crave more than he cared to admit. He had taken a dose before leaving the banquet last night, just enough to lift the fog of conversation, to help him endure the glittering lights that stabbed too sharply at his eyes. But once home, the urge had returned. He had slipped into his study, uncorked the vial, and breathed deeply, more deeply than usual, until time softened into something vague and gentle. Now, time refused to sharpen again. Margaret rose suddenly, knocking her chair against the floor. "Thomas, look at me." He did, and in her face he saw not anger, but something far worse. Fear. "I'm calling Dr. Finch," she declared. "No," Mr. Everleigh snapped far too quickly. "No, doctor." His vehemence startled her. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Panic pooled behind his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "Just give me a moment." He stood abruptly from the table, though he wasn't quite sure why or where he intended to go. The room swayed. The chandelier overhead blurred, its light splintering like shards of glass. Margaret took a step forward to steady him, but he staggered away. "Thomas." He reached the mirror above the fireplace, bracing himself on the mantel as he stared at the man reflected there. The face was familiar, sharp jaw, dark hair, a faint line between the brows. But the eyes were wild, frantic, unmoored. "Who are you?" he whispered. The reflection did not answer. Margaret gasped softly. "Thomas, please." But he shook his head violently. I can't remember." His voice broke. The truth rushed in like cold water. The ether had stolen something from him in the night, something essential, a sliver of memory, a piece of himself, and it might not be the last. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears she fought desperately to hide. She stepped closer, but he recoiled instinctively, as though afraid his unraveling might spread to her like a contagion. For a long moment, they remained frozen in the quiet room, a man losing his identity, and a woman realizing she was standing at the threshold of a tragedy neither of them yet understood. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a waiting witness. Inside, Mr. Everleigh clutched the mantel as though anchoring himself to a world he no longer recognized, one where a gentleman could forget his own name after just one night too deep in ether's embrace. And the worst part was this. Somewhere inside him, beneath the panic and confusion, a small voice whispered that he wanted more. The scandal began on a rain-slick Thursday evening, quiet as a teardrop sliding down glass. It started in the most ordinary of places, Lady Whittingdale's annual charity gala, held in a sprawling townhouse whose windows glowed like lanterns against the storm. The event promised refinement and benevolence, fundraising for the city orphanage, a silent auction, polite conversation conducted beneath ceilings painted with cherubs. It was meant to be an evening beyond reproach, which is precisely why everyone tried so hard to pretend nothing had happened. Lady Ashcombe arrived in a pale lavender gown, smiling with a composure she had stitched onto herself like an accessory. Clara, as always, followed in silence, though she watched her mistress closely, too closely, perhaps for the tremor that had returned that afternoon. It was small, manageable, but unmistakable. Lady Ashcombe had retreated to her boudoir before leaving the house, emerging only after just a drop to steady her nerves. Tonight, however, the drop had not been enough. As guests mingled beneath chandeliers and admired the delicate pastry towers, Lady Ashcombe drifted through the crowd as though gliding on a cushion of fragrance. Compliments clung to the air like perfume, though more than one guest observed out of the corner of their eye how brightly her pupils shone beneath the candlelight. "Lady Ashcombe, how radiant you look," murmured Lady Whittingdale herself. "You are too kind," Lady Ashcombe replied, though her voice trembled faintly beneath the sweetness. The orchestra began softly, violins swelling like a silk curtain, and yet something strange lingered beneath the beauty of the evening. A flicker of unease, a faint shimmer of tension threading through the room like invisible smoke. It happened just after the silent auction began. One moment, Lady Ashcombe was conversing politely with Lord Harrington, her words drifting in gentle, opiate-washed rhythm, and the next, her voice faltered. She blinked, blinking again, as though attempting to clear fog from her vision. "My lady?" Lord Harrington asked softly. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Instead, a sudden wash of pallor engulfed her face. Her gloved hand fluttered upward as though seeking something to hold on to. Then she collapsed. Her body folded like a wilting flower, her knees buckling beneath her with a grace that was almost eerie. A gasp rippled through the room. The orchestra faltered. A footman rushed forward, barely catching her before she struck the polished floor. For one suspended moment, the room froze. "Someone fetch a doctor," cried Lady Whittingdale. But no one moved. Everyone, in their heart, already knew which doctor would be summoned. Dr. Harriman Finch, arriving with suspicious swiftness, cut through the crowd like a shadowed figure from a painted backdrop. He knelt beside Lady Ashcombe, checked her pulse, whispered something inaudible beneath his breath. Clara stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly together, her face white as moonlit linen. "Overexertion," Dr. Finch announced calmly. "A touch of fatigue. The lady simply needs air." But the guests exchanged glances, quick, nervous flashes of recognition. A woman had fainted at the opera only last week. A gentleman had collapsed in his club 2 nights before. A debutante had been sent home early from a ball after feeling faint. There was a pattern, though no one dared to trace it. Margaret Everleigh, who had attended despite her husband's worsening condition, whispered behind her fan, "It's spreading." "Hush," another murmured. "Not here." 2 footmen carried Lady Ashcombe to a quiet withdrawing room. Clara followed, heart pounding. Within minutes, Lady Ashcombe stirred, her breath shallow but steady. "Do not speak of this," Dr. Finch instructed Clara in a low voice. "The mistress simply requires rest." Clara nodded, though her throat tightened. She knew the truth. She had seen the bottle hidden behind the lace. She had watched her mistress tremble throughout the afternoon. She had smelled the sweetness clinging to her gloves. And she knew deep in her bones that the doctor's reassuring smile was only pushing the truth deeper into the shadows. By the following morning, the incident was already being erased. The Whittingdale staff were instructed to say Lady Ashcombe had suffered a momentary faint from the heat. Guests, one by one, agreed it must have been nothing. A whisper here, a murmur there, but always spoken with the same cautious glance to ensure no outsider overheard. Not a single newspaper printed a word. The scandal died before it could be born, suffocated by etiquette and fear. But Clara understood something the others did not. When a society hides its illnesses, they do not fade. They fester. And Lady Ashcombe's collapse, quietly erased and neatly buried, was not an end. It was the beginning of a truth too large to contain behind lace fans and closed drawing-room doors. The parlour at Ashcombe Manor had always been a room built for hours-long, unhurried hours spent in embroidery, reading, quiet conversation, or simply watching the fog roll past the windows. It was a soft room, full of muted pastels and gentle fabrics, where sunlight fell in warm rectangles and the air smelled faintly of rosewater. Time usually moved slowly here, like tea cooling in a porcelain cup. But now, time behaved differently. Time slipped. Lady Ashcombe discovered this one late afternoon, when the house settled into its familiar lull, and she retreated to the parlour in search of calm. Her nerves felt frayed, her breath unsteady, and the tremor in her hands threatened to betray her again at dinner. Clara had suggested rest, but rest had become unbearable. The quiet made the shaking louder. The parlour was her refuge, or so she hoped. She closed the door behind her, exhaling shakily. The late sun cast long amber beams across the carpet, dust motes floating like drifting gold. She crossed to the settee and lowered herself carefully, running her fingertips along the embroidered cushion. The tremor pulsed beneath her skin steadily, insistently. She reached into her reticule. The bottle was cool beneath her fingers, the glass smooth as river stone. She hesitated for a moment, her breath catching. Dr. Finch had given her a fresh prescription just days ago, assuring her it was perfectly safe, perfectly controlled, perfectly necessary. "Just a little," she whispered. "Just enough to steady the world." The cork gave its familiar soft pop. The sweetness rose like a delicate ghost, frosted, clean, deceptively bright. She inhaled deeply, letting the vapor slide into her lungs. Relief flooded her. Warmth, softness, a loosening of the tight bands that had constricted her ribs since morning. She breathed again, and time slipped. At first, the shift was subtle. A minute of stillness elongated into something languid and undefined. The clock on the mantel ticked, but its rhythm no longer felt aligned with her pulse. The carpet's rose-patterned border shimmered faintly. Shadows lengthened in ways they should not, stretching too far along the walls like dark ribbons unspooling. Lady Ashcombe blinked slowly, as though her eyelids were weighted with velvet. When she opened them again, the sun had shifted. Minutes? Hours? She could not say. The parlour felt different, quieter, darker, as though pulled into a deeper part of the house. Her silk sleeve had slipped from her shoulder. Her head rested against the settee's curved arm, though she did not remember lying down. One of her shoes was missing. Her heart fluttered uneasily. "How long?" she murmured, though the room offered no answer. She sat up too quickly. The world swayed in a slow arc, as though the house itself were exhaling beneath her feet. Her hand flew to the edge of the settee to steady herself, her fingers brushing something cold and smooth. The bottle, but it looked emptier than before. Far emptier. A throb of dread crept up her spine. She tried to piece together what had happened, how many sips, how many breaths, but her memory blurred like damp ink. Fragments surfaced and vanished, a flicker of laughter, a shiver of fear, a moment where she might have cried out, but at whom? For what? The clock chimed the hour. 7. Impossible. She had entered the room shortly after 4. Another wave of dizziness washed over her. She grasped the bottle with trembling fingers and slipped it into her reticule, swallowing hard. Outside the parlour door, footsteps approached, steady, careful, familiar. Clara. "My lady," came her voice, muffled through the wood. "It is nearly time to dress for dinner." Lady Ashcombe froze. She looked down at her dishevelled gown, at her bare foot, at the faint mark on her wrist where the bottle had rested. She smoothed her hair, straightened her bodice, slipped her shoe back on with trembling haste. Then she stood, forcing her breath into something that resembled calm. When she opened the door, Clara's eyes flicked instantly to the paling skin beneath her mistress's eyes, to the slight sheen of sweat on her brow, to the way she leaned ever so slightly against the doorframe. "Are you unwell, my lady?" Lady Ashcombe smiled. Too brightly. Too quickly. "Of course not," she whispered. "I simply lost track of time." Clara hesitated. "For 3 hours." Lady Ashcombe's smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "The afternoon sun made me drowsy." Clara lowered her gaze, hiding the truth she already suspected. The parlour had not made her drowsy. The ether had stolen the hours. And Lady Ashcombe, standing there with a forced smile and trembling hands, began to realize a fear she had not dared name. If time itself could slip through her fingers, what else might she lose next? The Harringtons' winter musicale was always an exquisite affair, a polished ritual of sonatas, string quartets, and polite applause drifting through a salon trimmed in pale blue silk. Musicians from the conservatory performed in a semicircle beneath a chandelier that cast delicate constellations across the ceiling. It was an evening meant to soothe the mind, to remind London's most refined families why civilization existed at all. But on this particular night, the music sounded wrong. Not to everyone, just to those already walking the thin, shimmering line between composure and collapse. Lady Ashcombe arrived with Lord Ashcombe on her arm, her gown a sweep of ivory satin that glowed softly in the candlelight. She appeared exquisite, almost luminous, yet Clara noticed the way her mistress's left hand hovered near her bodice, where her reticule rested. The tremor had returned earlier in the afternoon, subtle but insistent. A dose had been taken before dressing. A second dose, Lady Ashcombe insisted, would be unnecessary. Clara doubted that very much. Inside the salon, the music began, a quartet of strings opening with a lilting allegro that spilled gently across the room. Guests leaned back in their chairs, fans fluttering softly, heads nodding in polite delight. The musicians played flawlessly, and yet, to Lady Ashcombe, something felt off. The first violin seemed too sharp, its notes slicing like thin blades. The cello's low hum vibrated through her bones in a way that felt almost unnatural. Even the soft plucking of the viola seemed to pulse with a strange, echoing rhythm. She blinked, trying to steady her senses, but the sounds only grew more peculiar, stretching, bending, vibrating in ways she could not quite explain. A cold bead of sweat slid down her spine. She tried to shift in her seat, but her limbs felt heavy, almost lagging behind her thoughts. The room's perimeter blurred, the edges of the wallpaper patterns melting like wet paint. The chandelier above her flickered not in its light, but in its shape, swaying softly though no breeze passed through the room. "My dear, are you well?" Lord Ashcombe whispered beside her. "Yes," she lied instantly. The heat is simply stifling. But the room was cool, unnaturally so. From across the salon, Lady Ashcombe noticed Lord Pembroke sitting stiffly, his eyes unfocused, his fingers tapping too quickly against the armrest, an agitated tremor he attempted to mask with a cough. His flask, no doubt, had been emptied earlier that evening. And now, like her, he was hearing the music through ether-drenched nerves. The musicians launched into a more vigorous movement. The violins soared, and the sound fractured. Lady Ashcombe inhaled sharply. The notes seemed to separate, splitting into thin, shimmering strands that spiraled upward like silver threads unraveling in the air. She could almost see them, thin lines of sound, stretching and warping as though the music itself were coming undone. She gripped her fan tightly. A woman in the row ahead shifted uncomfortably, glancing sideways at her husband. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" he asked. That tremor in the music. It vibrates." He frowned. "It sounds perfectly normal to me." Lady Ashcombe realized with a slow, dawning terror. It wasn't the music that had changed. It was her. The ether had woven itself into her senses, warping what was soft, bending what was gentle, magnifying the smallest irregularity into something uncanny. Every note felt too bright, every vibration too deep. The entire room seemed suspended in an uneasy, shimmering haze. A sharp spike of sound from the violin made her flinch. Several guests glanced her way. She forced a smile, fanning herself more quickly now. Across the salon, Mr. Everleigh, once the epitome of composure, sat rigid, eyes darting with barely contained panic. His wife clutched his arm, whispering urgently. Only a week ago, he had forgotten his own name. Tonight, the music seemed to unravel him further. Another dissonant swell of strings filled the air. Lady Ashcombe's breath caught. The sound spiraled, folding over itself, swelling, tightening. Then, abruptly, it snapped back to normal. The musicians played on, unaware of the distortion that had rippled through the minds of those quietly falling apart in their seats. Clara stepped closer to her mistress, sensing the danger before anyone else could. Her eyes widened at the pallor beneath Lady Ashcombe's powdered cheeks. "My lady," she whispered urgently, "perhaps we should leave." But Lady Ashcombe shook her head, blinking rapidly as the room steadied. "No, everyone is watching." The quartet reached its final chord. Applause erupted, polite, measured, elegant. But for those caught in ether's delicate, treacherous grasp, the music had left behind more than melody. It had left a warning. Lady Ashcombe exhaled shakily, her pulse racing beneath her gown. The tremor in her hands had returned, despite her attempts to hide it. The music had turned strange tonight, not because the musicians faltered, but because she was beginning to. Morning crept into Ashcombe Manor with a pale, hesitant glow, the kind of washed-out light that seemed to soften the edges of reality rather than clarify them. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and high windows draped in damask, looked as elegant as ever. Polished silver glinted from every place setting. The scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the warm aroma of baked rolls, honeyed porridge, and stewed apples. But something was wrong. For all its beauty, the table remained untouched. Clara noticed it first. She stepped quietly into the room with a fresh pot of tea, only to find the breakfast laid out exactly as she had arranged it an hour earlier. Not a fork had shifted. Not a crumb had fallen. The porridge had formed a thin skin across its surface. The toast had cooled. The air felt uneasy. Moments later, Lady Ashcombe entered, moving with a grace that faltered only in the smallest steps. She wore a morning gown of cream muslin, her hair pinned softly at the nape of her neck. At first glance, she looked composed. Only Clara, ever watchful, saw the truth beneath the surface. Lady Ashcombe's eyes were ringed with a faint violet shadow. Her lips, though tinted with rose, trembled ever so slightly when she exhaled. and her right hand, the hand she hid beneath a delicate lace handkerchief, quivered despite her efforts to still it. "Good morning, Clara," she murmured. "Good morning, my lady," Clara replied gently. "Shall I pour your tea?" "Please." Lady Ashcombe sat at the head of the table. Clara poured, the amber liquid swirling into the cup with soft steam, but when Lady Ashcombe lifted it, her fingers shuddered. Clara stepped forward reflexively, though her mistress waved her away with a frail smile. "It's quite all right," she whispered. It wasn't. Lord Ashcombe entered moments later, looking unusually dishevelled. His cravat sat slightly askew. His expression was tight. He took his seat across from his wife and cleared his throat in a way that carried more unspoken questions than words. "You look pale," he said softly. "Only a poor night's sleep," she replied. He hesitated, fingers drumming the table. "Was it the musicale?" Lady Ashcombe froze. A flicker panic, memory, dizziness passed through her eyes. "No," she said too quickly. "The music was lovely." She forced a sip of tea to end the conversation. The cup rattled gently against the saucer when she set it down. Lord Ashcombe reached for the toast but paused when he saw her untouched plate. "My dear, won't you eat?" he asked, his tone hovering between concern and suspicion. "I will," Lady Ashcombe replied. "In a moment." But the moment never came. Her stomach churned with an empty, restless nausea, the kind that came not from hunger, but from the remnants of last night's ether drifting coldly through her veins. Eating felt impossible. Breathing felt strained. Her senses felt stretched thin, as though any small sensation might tip her one way or the other. Across the table, Lord Ashcombe placed his hand over hers, an act meant to steady her. She flinched. Just barely. His eyes narrowed. "Charlotte," he whispered, "something is wrong." Clara, standing by the sideboard, stiffened. Lady Ashcombe withdrew her hand slowly. "I assure you, nothing is amiss." But her voice cracked on the last word. Lord Ashcombe leaned back in his chair. His gaze drifted to the untouched food, to the trembling of her fingers, to the faint sheen of sweat above her collarbone. "This can't continue," he said quietly. Her pulse quickened. Clara held her breath. For a moment, Lady Ashcombe's mask slipped, her eyes widening with a flash of something raw and terrified, as though he had spoken aloud a truth she had fought desperately to bury. Then, just as quickly, her composure returned. "We're merely overtired," she insisted. "Both of us. It has been a busy season." Her husband did not answer. Clara approached carefully. "My lady, shall I bring you a lighter breakfast? Perhaps fruit?" Lady Ashcombe forced a smile. "No, thank you. I shall eat later." But she wouldn't. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping softly against the rug. "If you'll excuse me, I must prepare for the day." She glided from the room, posture flawless. Only when she reached the corridor did she falter, one hand pressing to the wall for balance. Her breath came in a shallow gasp. A cold tremor rippled through her. She clutched her reticule. The bottle inside clinked faintly. Just a drop, she told herself. Just enough to steady the hands. Just enough to silence the fear. Just enough to make the world stop tilting. Behind her, in the dining room, the untouched breakfast sat cooling beneath a golden morning sun, silent evidence of a household slipping quietly, irrevocably, into ruin. The stain appeared small at first, no larger than a thumbprint on pale silk, but Clara recognized it instantly. She found the glove discarded near the edge of Lady Ashcombe's dressing table late one afternoon. Its fingers curled delicately as though still holding an invisible secret. The faint, sharp sweetness clung to the fabric, unmistakable to a nose that had grown reluctant familiarity with it. Ether. Clara lifted the glove gently, turning it beneath the lamplight. The tiny discoloration shimmered faintly, as if the liquid had left behind not just a mark, but a memory. Her heart tightened. Spillage meant haste, carelessness, or desperation. And desperation was becoming a regular visitor at Ashcombe Manor. She heard footsteps. Quickly, Clara tucked the glove behind her apron just as Lady Ashcombe entered the room. Her mistress looked beautiful, painfully so, the kind of beauty sculpted not by health or ease, but by the sheer force of will. Her cheeks had been pinched with a touch of rouge, her hair arranged in a soft knot of curls, her gown a delicate lavender muslin that floated as she walked. She appeared radiant, until one looked too closely. There, beneath the artistry, lay exhaustion. The faint tremor of a hand smoothing her skirts, the too bright gleam in her pupils, the slightest sway in her step before she steadied herself on the back of a chair. "Clara," she said softly, "have you seen my gloves?" Clara swallowed. "Which pair, my lady?" "The silk ones, the pale ones with the embroidery at the wrist." Silence, a heartbeat too long. "I shall look for them," Clara murmured, dipping her head to hide the worry in her eyes. Lady Ashcombe's gaze drifted not to the floor or the mirror, but toward the vanity drawer, the one that held the bottle wrapped in silk. Her fingers twitched toward it before she caught herself, folding them primly in front of her. The tremor betrayed her. Clara's voice was soft. "My lady, perhaps you should rest before the carriage arrives." "No," Lady Ashcombe replied too quickly. "I'm perfectly capable." But her hand shook again, ever so slightly. As she crossed the room, her foot caught on the edge of the rug. She steadied herself on the dresser, and something within the drawer shifted with a muffled clink. Clara saw the flicker of panic cross her mistress's face, not at the stumble, but at the betrayed sound. Lady Ashcombe opened the drawer with steady fingers, too steady, too careful. She withdrew her fan, a lace-edged thing that fluttered like a nervous bird in her hand. "There," she murmured, though no one had asked. But her eyes darted again toward the drawer, toward the bottle that waited for her, the way a shadow waits for sunset. Clara lowered her gaze, but she could feel the tension in the air, fragile, stretched thin, humming like a violin string drawn too tight. Lady Ashcombe sat on the edge of the chaise, exhaling shakily. Her hands clasped together, but a tremor rippled through them. Clara stepped forward. "My lady," she whispered, unable to stop herself. "The stain on your glove. It might be from—" Lady Ashcombe's head snapped up. For a moment, her expression was sharp, brittle, like cracked porcelain. "From what, Clara?" she asked, voice trembling with a warning. Clara's courage faltered. "Perhaps something spilled when you were dressing." The mistress's eyes softened with fragile relief. "Yes, a perfume mishap, no doubt." But they both heard the lie settle between them. Lady Ashcombe rose abruptly. "Bring me a fresh pair," she said, turning toward the mirror. "These hands mustn't be seen trembling." She lifted her chin, trying to reclaim the poise she wore like armor. But Clara noticed the truth behind the reflection. The tremor was stronger tonight. Her mistress's pupils were wide, and the silk glove, its small, shimmering stain, had begun to symbolize something neither dared name aloud. When Clara left the room to fetch another pair of gloves, she held the stained one tightly in her apron. The faint scent clung to her like a haunting reminder. Lady Ashcombe did not see Clara's tears when she reached the hallway, nor did she see the way her maid clutched the glove as though it were evidence of a slow, quiet disaster unfolding beneath lace and silk. The stain was small, but it marked the beginning of something far larger, a truth that could no longer be hidden with powder, perfume, or polite society's practiced smiles. The nursery at Ashcombe Manor had once been a place of soft laughter, bright wooden toys scattered across the carpet, picture books stacked in crooked towers, and the sound of small feet padding eagerly across morning sunlight. It had smelled of warm milk, lavender soap, and the faint sweetness of sponge cake filched from the kitchen. A gentle world tucked safely beneath the grandeur of the estate. But lately, The nursery had grown quieter, much quieter. The two Ashcombe children, little Henry, aged 6, and his sister Marianne, aged 9, had become shadows of themselves, moving with a hush that did not belong in childhood. They listened more, spoke less. Their games were softer now, as though they feared their voices might shatter something fragile in the house. This morning, Marianne sat beside the window, braiding and unbraiding the same length of ribbon with small, solemn fingers. Henry knelt on the carpet, arranging toy soldiers in a precise, uncharacteristically silent line. Their governess, Mrs. Talbot, knitted in her chair, though her needles clicked slower than usual, her gaze drifting often toward the corridor. "Do you think she's awake yet?" Henry whispered. Marianne glanced at the door. "Hush." "But—" "Hush," she repeated firmly, lowering her voice until it became barely a breath. "Papa said not to disturb her." Henry wrinkled his nose. "But she's always sleeping now." "No," Marianne murmured, though her voice wavered. "She's only resting." Resting. The word adults used when they didn't want children to understand. But Marianne understood more than they realized. She had seen the tremor in her mother's hand when she poured tea. She had heard the hurried whispers between the servants. She had noticed how her mother locked her boudoir door when she never used to. She had smelled the strange, sharp sweetness that clung to her mother's gloves. She did not understand the cause, but she understood the fear. Henry, too, had noticed things. How Mama's hugs felt different now, lighter, trembling, as though she could only hold him for a second before pulling away. How she sometimes stared past him, as though looking at something far away. How she forgot the words to the bedtime story she had read to him since he was 3. "Marianne?" he whispered again. "Is Mama sick?" Marianne's fingers slipped. The ribbon unbraided itself. She swallowed. "She's tired. But why does it smell funny when she hugs me now?" Marianne stiffened. "I don't know." But she did know. Or she thought she did. She had asked Clara once quietly, timidly, what the smell was. Clara had turned pale and shaken her head, telling her it was nothing. But children sensed lies the way birds sensed storms. Henry crawled to Marianne's side. "I don't like it," he said softly. "I don't either." Mrs. Talbot looked up sharply. "Children," she said, her voice gentle but strained, "let's focus on our lessons." But Marianne saw the tightness in the governess's jaw. She knew Mrs. Talbot whispered with Clara at night. She knew both women cast worried glances whenever Lady Ashcombe passed through the halls. Smile too bright, steps too hurried. From the window, Marianne could see the drive below. The family carriage sat waiting, horses stamping the cobblestones impatiently. They were supposed to go riding in Hyde Park today. Mama had promised her voice high and warm when she told them the night before, though her pupils were wider than usual, her fingers drumming lightly against her palm. But she had not come down. The house was too still. A soft knock sounded at the nursery door. Clara entered quietly, her expression composed but her eyes weighed down by worry. "Mrs. Talbot," she said, "Lord Ashcombe asks that the children remain upstairs today. Their mother needs rest." There it was again. Rest. Marianne didn't look at Clara. She looked at the way Clara's hands clasped the edge of her apron, the gesture tense enough to reveal what her words hid. Henry tugged Marianne's sleeve. "Does Mama not want to play any more?" Marianne's throat tightened. She pulled him close and held him there, her small arms wrapped around his shoulders. "It's not that," she whispered, though the words wobbled. "Mama loves us. She's just not herself." Henry sniffed. "When will she be herself again?" Marianne blinked back tears. "I don't know." Clara stepped forward, kneeling to their level. Her voice trembled despite her efforts. "Your mother loves you both very dearly," she said. "Remember that, and try to stay quiet today. She needs calm." Marianne nodded, though she felt a cold weight settle deep in her chest. As Clara left, the door closing softly behind her, the nursery fell silent once more. The children returned to their activities, Marianne braiding the same ribbon with distant eyes, Henry lining up his toy soldiers with solemn care. But beneath the quiet, beneath their small, brave attempts at normalcy, lingered a truth neither dared speak. They were learning, far too young, how to tiptoe around the fragility of an adult they loved, learning to whisper instead of laugh, learning to hide their questions, learning that something terrible could grow inside a house without ever being mentioned, and learning, most painfully of all, that their mother was slipping away from them one tremor, one lie, one quiet dose at a time. The Ashcombe estate agent arrived on a grey morning that seemed unwilling to wake, its feeble light leaking through a sky thick with winter cloud. His carriage bore no crest, his coat was unremarkable, and he walked with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to handling delicate affairs. He was not the type of visitor one announced to the household. He was the type one ushered in quietly, through the side entrance, with the curtains drawn and the staff told to mind their own duties. Lord Ashcombe greeted him in the study, a room that once exuded dignity with its walnut shelves and leather-bound folios, but now held an air of strained formality. Papers were stacked too neatly. Logs in the grate burned with too careful a precision. The atmosphere felt staged, as though concealing something cracked beneath. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Lord Ashcombe murmured, gesturing the agent inside. The agent bowed his head. "Of course, my lord. Discretion is our specialty." Those last words settled heavily in the space between them. They both knew why he was here. Land. Small parcels. A corner of farmland on the outskirts. A portion of woodland that no one visited anymore. Pieces of the estate to be sold quietly before anyone could ask why. Lord Ashcombe reached for a decanter of brandy but stopped himself, his hand trembling ever so slightly before he folded it behind his back. "My wife is unwell," he said finally, the words barely more than breath, "and the season has been costly." The agent did not ask how. He did not need to. Rumours had begun to slither through polite society. Fainting spells at the opera, tremors seen at the gala, whispers of a strange sweetness clinging to Lady Ashcombe's gloves, a physician called too often, a chemist's deliveries made too discreetly. "I understand, my lord," the agent replied. He withdrew a ledger, tapping the pages with care. "There are buyers interested in the southern fields. The transaction can be done through intermediaries. No one need see your family name attached." Lord Ashcombe nodded, though his jaw tightened. Selling land was no small matter, not for a family whose pride was rooted in acres that had belonged to Ashcombes for generations. But pride had begun to dissolve beneath the weight of whispers, of medical bills, of nights when Lady Ashcombe's trembling became a silent torment behind closed doors. "When can it be done?" he asked. "Within a fortnight." Lord Ashcombe closed his eyes briefly. "Good." But standing outside the study, hidden by the half-open door, Clara heard every word. She had come only to deliver fresh linens to the adjoining room, but the conversation froze her in place. A chill raced down her spine, icy, creeping, merciless. Selling the estate? Pieces of it, yes, but even that was unthinkable. Clara knew Lord Ashcombe was a man of order, of calculation, of financial prudence. For him to consider such a sale meant something had begun to unravel far more severely than anyone had dared to admit. When the agent departed again through the side door, Lord Ashcombe remained alone in the study, staring at the dying fire. His shoulders sank beneath a weight that was no longer invisible. Clara slipped away before he noticed her. She pressed her hands to her apron, her pulse thundering. Lady Ashcombe did not rise until nearly midday. Clara helped her dress lavender silk today, chosen to brighten her pallor, but the tremor was there again, fluttering like a frightened bird beneath the skin. Her mistress's eyes were duller than yesterday, but her smile was fixed, unwavering. A fragile mask clinging to a face that no longer had the strength to hold it. "Is something bothering the household?" Lady Ashcombe asked lightly. "The corridors feel different." Clara paused. "It is nothing, my lady, only the weather." But she could not bring herself to meet her mistress's gaze. Lady Ashcombe looked at her reflection, at the faint shadows beneath her eyes, at the tremor she attempted to hide by folding her hands. There was silence, a silence that felt like winter settling into the walls. Down in the study, Lord Ashcombe signed papers that bound part of their legacy to strangers. Upstairs, Lady Ashcombe adjusted a pearl earring with shaking fingers. And in the corridor, Clara pressed her hand against her chest, fighting the crushing knowledge that the estate was beginning to crumble, not from debt nor misfortune, but from the quiet, poisonous secret destroying the family from within. The sale would be conducted in silence. No guests would know. No servants would dare whisper it aloud. But the walls of Ashcombe Manor had begun to shift, and nothing, not propriety, not wealth, not the illusion of normalcy, could stop the slow, devastating undoing already underway. Mr. Harrowby always kept his ledger locked beneath the counter, its leather cover worn smooth by years of careful handling. It was not a complicated book, merely a neat catalogue of purchases, dates, quantities, and initials. But it was the kind of book that could dismantle reputations, crumble marriages, and undo entire family lines if placed in the wrong hands. No one outside his shop had ever seen it, until the day he dropped it. The morning had begun quietly, with a thin drizzle painting the cobblestones outside the chemist's shop. The lamps flickered weakly behind streaked glass, as Mr. Harrowby arranged tinctures beside herbal tonics, each bottle aligned with ritual precision. He did not notice his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from the weight of recognition that had settled on him for months. The bell chimed. A gentleman stepped inside, collar turned up, eyes darting nervously. Mr. Harrowby recognized him immediately, the third such visitor before noon. A magistrate's son, no less. "Good morning," Mr. Harrowby murmured. The gentleman avoided his gaze. "I require the same. Quickly, if you please." Mr. Harrowby nodded and reached for the key to unlock the ledger. He always checked names before dispensing, ensuring no errors, no duplicate orders too close together. As he slid the ledger from its compartment, the gentleman's urgency unnerved him. The book slipped. It struck the wooden floor with a dull thud. The ledger fell open. Pages spread wide like cracked wings. Names stared up at him. Dozens of them. Names he recognized. Names London trusted. Lady Ashcombe. Lord Pembroke. Mr. Everleigh. Mrs. Whittingdale's niece. The Harrington twins. A duchess. A viscount's daughter. A judge's wife. Several members of Parliament. All written in the same delicate script. All purchasing the same clear solution. All marked with the same discreet symbol in the corner, E. The magistrate's son paled visibly as he caught sight of the list. "Good God!" "Do not look," Mr. Harrowby said sharply, snapping the book closed. But the damage was done. Is it truly so many?" the young man whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. Mr. Harrowby steadied the ledger in his hands, his throat tight. He had seen the pattern forming for months, initials repeating too frequently, orders growing larger, visits becoming more frantic. He had tried to convince himself that it was coincidence, that society's ailments were merely more visible this season, that nerves were simply frayed by cold and gossip. But the truth stared back at him in black ink. It was not a trend. It was not a phase. It was an epidemic, one he had quietly supplied. He locked the ledger away before the young man could speak again. "Your vial, sir," he said quietly, handing over the small parcel. The gentleman grabbed it with shaking fingers and slipped out into the rain, not bothering to hide the panic in his step. Once alone, Mr. Harrowby sank onto the stool behind the counter. He pressed a hand to his brow, breathing shallowly. The shop felt smaller suddenly, suffocating. The rows of bottles on the shelves seemed to watch him, each one a silent witness to what he had helped create. He did not consider himself a wicked man. He had always believed he was serving a need, an ailment, a medical necessity. He had trusted Dr. Finch's prescriptions, trusted society's insistence that ether was harmless, refined, even fashionable. But now, he lifted the ledger from the drawer and opened it again, slower this time. His finger traced the names, every one of them, someone important, someone respected, someone with much to lose if the truth ever surfaced. He felt the weight of their secrets pressing down upon him with suffocating force. The bell chimed again. This time, it was Clara. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her breath shallow from concern. She clutched a folded note, Lord Ashcombe's handwriting. "My mistress requires another bottle," she said softly, almost apologetically. Mr. Harrowby did not answer immediately. He stared at her, at the quiet desperation in her eyes, at the fatigue etched into her features from carrying a burden that was not hers to bear. He thought of Lady Ashcombe's trembling hands, her fainting spells, her hollow eyes. He thought of the ledger, its pages filled with lives slipping silently toward ruin, and for the first time he hesitated. Clara noticed. "Mr. Harrowby?" He exhaled, the sound weary and thin. "Wait here." He disappeared behind the curtain, gripping the ledger tightly in his hand. For a long moment, Clara stood alone among the bottles, feeling as though she were in a room full of ghosts. When Mr. Harrowby finally returned, he held the vial wrapped in brown paper, but his hand lingered over it, as if reluctant to release it. "Clara," he said quietly, "tell Lady Ashcombe the dosage must not increase. It is already too much." Clara nodded slowly, swallowing her fear. But she knew with painful certainty that the warning would change nothing, because the ledger was already full, because the names were already written, because the descent had already begun, and because no one doctor, maid, chemist, or noble could stop what ether had woven into the very heart of Victorian society. The fog rolled in thick that evening, so thick it seemed to swallow the street lamps whole, leaving only faint halos of light quivering in the murk. London wore the fog like a shroud, muffling hoofbeats, swallowing footsteps, and softening even the sharpest cries into ghostly murmurs. It was the kind of night that made the city feel ancient and watchful, as though the cobblestones themselves remembered every secret ever whispered upon them. It was on such a night that Miss Arabella Farringdon, heiress to one of the largest fortunes in Mayfair, wandered into the fog and did not return for hours. Arabella had been a darling of society. Flawless posture, an enviable dowry, beauty described in breathless terms by matrons eager to secure her for their sons. She had always glowed beneath candlelight, radiant, warm, effortless. But lately her brilliance had dimmed, replaced by a faint, feverish sheen. Whispers trailed behind her at dinner parties. She had been seen at Mr. Harrowby's shop more than once, and at the Harrington Music Ale, her laughter had carried a brittle, overly bright edge. On this night, the Farringdon household should have been preparing for a supper engagement. Instead, Miss Arabella slipped quietly out the servants' door, wearing nothing more than her evening cloak and a pair of satin slippers, wholly unsuited for the damp. No one saw her leave. No one, except her maid Alice, whose instincts had sharpened painfully over the past months. Alice noticed the disappearance at once. The cloak missing from its peg, the slippers gone, the faint scent lingering in the hallway, sweet, chemical, unmistakable. "Miss Arabella?" she whispered into the dim corridor. There was no answer. Panic clenched in Alice's throat. She grabbed her shawl and rushed outside, the cold fog clinging instantly to her hair like wet lace. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp earth. The gas lamps flickered, barely piercing the gloom. Alice hurried down the stoop, calling again. "Miss Arabella!" Still nothing. Her mistress's footprints, small, delicate, trailed across the wet cobbles before dissolving into nothingness. Alice followed the direction they pointed, toward Grosvenor Square, where the fog thickened like a living thing. She walked quickly, heart pounding, breath forming pale clouds. She passed gentlemen hurrying home, cloaked figures stepping into carriages, and a constable patrolling with a lantern that glowed only faintly in the haze. At last, near the square's central garden, she found a figure, a pale silhouette, still barely visible. "Miss Arabella!" Alice cried, rushing forward. Arabella stood motionless, one hand clinging to the iron railing surrounding the garden. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, unfocused, shimmering with some distant terror or wonder Alice could not decipher. Her hair clung to her cheeks, heavy with moisture. The satin slippers were soaked through. "Miss, you must come back," Alice whispered, wrapping an arm around her trembling shoulders. Arabella turned her head slowly. Her pupils were wide, so wide they swallowed the soft brown of her irises. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "I cannot feel the ground," she murmured. Cold fear swept through Alice. "You're just chilled, miss." "The fog." "No," Arabella whispered. "Not the cold. I lost the ground. It slipped." Her knees buckled. Alice caught her, cradling her like a child. "Come back with me, please." Arabella shook her head weakly. "I only meant to go for air, just for a moment. But the fog moved, and the street moved, and I followed something. I can't remember what." Alice tried not to let her fear show. Ether did this, she knew. Took time, took direction, took sense. Now it had nearly taken Arabella entirely. With great effort, Alice lifted her mistress and began guiding her back toward the house. Arabella shivered in her arms, whispering nonsense, half-formed thoughts, fractured memories, names of people who were not there. By the time they reached the Farringdon doorstep, Arabella had fallen silent, her breaths shallow and uneven. Alice called urgently for help, and 2 footmen rushed to assist, carrying the young heiress inside with care, usually reserved for precious heirlooms. The physician arrived an hour later. Dr. Finch, of course. He examined Arabella, whispered to her mother, and declared gently, "Exhaustion. She must rest. Rest. Again. Always rest." Alice stood in the corner of the room, gripping her hands together until her knuckles whitened. She knew better, because when she hung up Arabella's cloak to dry, a small bottle fell from its folds, a clear vial, wax-sealed, half-empty. Alice picked it up with trembling fingers. The fog outside pressed against the windows, silent as a spectre, and Alice understood perhaps more clearly than anyone else that the fog had not swallowed Miss Arabella. Ether had. The city's daughters were wandering now, not into danger, but into oblivion, and each time it grew harder to bring them back. The benches of the House of Commons were cold that morning, polished wood biting through the thin soles of shoes and stiff trousers. Gas lamps overhead hummed faintly, casting a yellowed light across leather-bound ledgers and stacks of correspondence. The chamber was quiet, unusually so, except for the scratch of quills and the occasional cough. London waited expectantly, though it did not yet know what had shifted. Mr. Everleigh was absent. Not merely absent in body, but absent in spirit, in awareness, in all the subtleties that gave a man his place among peers. He had been expected to deliver a speech on fiscal reform, a speech rehearsed for weeks, memorized line by line, polished with a precision that could impress the most discerning member of Parliament. The chamber had anticipated his voice rising, confident, deliberate, each sentence weighted with the authority of one who had earned it. Instead, his seat sat empty. His colleagues shifted uneasily, whispering quietly among themselves. The speaker's gavel tapped faintly against the desk. "Where is Mr. Everleigh?" The voice carried across the chamber, calm yet laced with concern. A page delivered a note, passed silently across polished benches. The handwriting trembled slightly, Everleigh's own, but the content was sparse, unable to attend, indisposed. Indisposed. A polite term for something far less simple. The news rippled through Parliament quietly at first, a soft murmur of confusion. Then the whispers began in earnest. "Indisposed?" one gentleman said. "He is never indisposed." Another leaned closer to his neighbour. "It is said he has visited Mr. Harraby's chemist shop late last evening, several times." "Surely not," murmured a third, though his eyes flickered toward Everleigh's empty bench. Everleigh himself sat in the solitude of his study, miles away from the chamber, pale and trembling. The ether he had inhaled late last night, or perhaps earlier, still coursed faintly through his veins, colouring perception with an unsteady warmth. The speech he had memorized was a distant echo, a whisper of ink and paper floating just beyond his grasp. He tried to recall the opening line, the phrasing, the cadence, but his thoughts twisted in fog, dissolving before he could pin them. His quill lay untouched. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, yet the room felt hot, suffocating, dense with the residual sweetness clinging to the air. He had taken one small sip from the vial, only one, but it had unspooled his mind in subtle ways. Minutes stretched into hours, words fled before they could be formed, memory unravelled like thread from a worn spool. He pressed his head into his hands. Tremor now reached his fingers, his jaw, his very pulse. Every breath rattled slightly in his chest. The sunlight that tried to pierce the tall window seemed diffused, melted through the mist of internal chaos he could not control. His clerk knocked softly at the door. "Sir, the session has begun." Everleigh tried to rise. His legs were leaden. His hands fumbled for coat and papers. He faltered, stumbling toward the door as though the chamber itself were a mile away. Outside, London hummed quietly, unaware that one of its steadiest voices had been rendered unreliable, even invisible, by a substance deemed harmless, fashionable, controlled. Ether bright, sweet, intoxicating had turned an accomplished gentleman into a trembling shadow of himself. Inside the House of Commons, the Speaker adjusted his spectacles, glancing toward the empty seat. Debates murmured, along with polite coughs. A sense of unease spread subtly through the chamber, though no one knew why. The absent speech, the missing words, the disappearance of such a precise mind, these were irregularities too faint for public scandal, but heavy enough to unsettle those attuned to perfection. Everleigh finally collapsed into his chair, gasping, trembling, barely able to steady the quill that had been his instrument of authority. He pressed the vial to his lips again, not out of desire, but necessity. The tremor was unbearable, the fog impenetrable. In the distance, a carriage clattered across cobblestones, carrying the day's news to Parliament, but not the truth. No reporter would record it, no ledger would note it, and no one in polite society would understand how a single inhalation had undone a man who had never before faltered. And so he remained silent, absent, and unseen while London continued to function, oblivious to the quiet, invisible decay sweeping through the lives of its most distinguished citizens. The city breathed differently during a lost weekend in Mayfair. Gas lamps glimmered behind thick fog, turning cobbled streets into silvered streams of light. Carriages glided silently over the wet stone, horses' hooves muffled by damp air. Shopkeepers shuttered early, their windows reflecting nothing but shadows. Behind the closed doors of elegant townhouses, the richest families of London stirred uneasily, though none dared speak of why. Lady Ashcombe had vanished. Not entirely. She had been seen briefly at the opera, briefly at the Harrington Musicale, briefly in her own boudoir, but only in fragments, like a ghost flickering between realities. The rest of the weekend, she was absent from every gathering, every engagement, every breakfast and dinner where she had once presided like the sun over the room. Her absence was noted politely, remarked upon gently, but never questioned directly. London society had a habit of ignoring its own fractures, of polishing cracks until they almost disappeared. Clara had followed her mistress from room to room, hall to hall, the click of her shoes swallowed by thick carpets and thickened dread. She had watched Lady Ashcombe drift between parlour and boudoir, bedroom and balcony, often pausing for moments that stretched longer than minutes, hours, perhaps. Time, it seemed, bent itself around the mistress, folding minutes into each other, erasing the markers that might allow anyone to measure reality. The ether bottle, small and gleaming, never left Lady Ashcombe's reticule. She carried it like a compass, guiding her through the haze of her own trembling mind. Every sip was precise, calibrated, deliberate, yet each brought with it the weight of consequence she refused to acknowledge. When she finally emerged on the third day, it was in a gown of soft green silk, cinched tightly at the waist, adorned with pearls that shimmered faintly under the gaslight. Her hair had been smoothed back into a style so perfect it might have belonged in a portrait. Yet beneath the elegance, her eyes were too wide, her pupils glimmering unnaturally, her lips pressed together in a fragile mask of control. The household watched quietly. Footmen lingered in corridors, eyes lowered, knowing better than to comment. Clara trailed silently behind, heart tight in her chest, each step echoing the unspoken understanding that the mistress had wandered through the weekend's hours almost entirely alone, guided by the subtle sweetness and cold promise of ether. Across the drawing-room, Lord Ashcombe paced, a newspaper crumpled in his hand. He had sent inquiries to friends, to society matrons, to household staff, and yet no one could offer more than fragments, moments glimpsed, whispers caught, the faint scent that had trailed through townhouses and parlours alike. Finally, Lady Ashcombe approached the breakfast table. Her movements were graceful, rehearsed, but the tremor returned subtly in her wrist, in the delicate flutter of a hand brushing against the silverware. Clara placed the tea before her silently, glancing down at the floor to avoid the shadow of despair in her mistress's eyes. "I trust you have rested," Lord Ashcombe said, his voice steady but wary. "The city has wondered about your absence." "Yes," Lady Ashcombe replied softly. I needed solitude." The words were careful, polished. Truth and fiction wove seamlessly together. Yet the tremor betrayed her, just slightly, just enough to show that solitude had been guided by something else entirely, a substance as silent and pervasive as the fog pressing against the windows. Clara poured the tea, hands trembling faintly. She could smell the faint sweetness lingering from earlier, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Lady Ashcombe raised the cup to her lips, inhaled the aroma, and let it drift through her senses like a memory. The lost weekend had stretched time itself, erased continuity, and left behind only the subtle ache of hours unmeasured, events half-remembered, and a reality shaped by vapors that promised calm while quietly undoing the self. Lord Ashcombe watched silently, wondering, fearing, and refusing to ask. The household obeyed the unspoken rule. Appearances must hold, even when foundations had begun to crumble. And as Lady Ashcombe sipped her tea, the city outside Mayfair continued in its ignorant grace, unaware of the quiet unravelling that had taken place within the walls of one of its most celebrated homes. For 3 days, Lady Ashcombe had wandered, not lost entirely, but displaced, and in the invisible corridors between her mind and the world, ether reigned, unchallenged, eternal, and exacting. The grand chamber of the House of Lords smelled of wax polish, leather-bound volumes, and centuries of unspoken decorum. Golden sunlight poured through tall stained windows, catching the polished surfaces of desks and benches alike. Statues of ancestors, some carved in marble, others painted on canvases framed with gilt, gazed silently down upon the proceedings. The atmosphere was meant to inspire respect, to demand composure, to remind every member of the sacredness of their duty. But on that day, composure faltered. The Duke of Kent, a man whose presence had always carried authority and ease, sat at his appointed bench, papers arranged meticulously before him. He had spent the morning reviewing speeches, notes, and amendments, preparing to speak on matters of finance and taxation. In normal circumstances, his hands were steady, his voice clear, his mind sharp. Today, however, something was wrong. His fingers shook. At first, it was subtle, a faint tremor as he unfolded a sheet of paper, barely noticeable to anyone else. But as he began to reach for the inkwell, the quill danced across his knuckles. The slightest spillage of ink marked the corner of his ledger, a small blot that would be ignored, but not unseen. He pressed a hand against his mouth, hoping no one noticed. Yet several members across the chamber glanced toward him with faint unease, whispering quietly among themselves. The Duke inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, willing the tremor to cease, willing his pulse to calm. He had not anticipated that the fatigue from last night's banquet would persist, nor the subtle, lingering influence of the ether he had taken to steady nerves before the evening had ended. A single, careful sip had promised composure. Instead, it had left him tethered to a fragile edge, teetering between dignity and collapse. He opened his eyes, scanning the chamber. The speaker adjusted his glasses, unaware of the quiet tremor pulsing through the Duke's hand. Peers rustled papers, whispered beneath gloved hands, but none dared approach. All were trained in appearances, and the Duke of Kent's reputation demanded perfection. He attempted to rise, quill in hand, intending to speak. The tremor worsened, fingers shaking violently as he gripped the lectern. His palms slicked slightly with perspiration. He pressed one hand against the mahogany to steady himself, feeling the slight give of polished wood beneath his fingers. The room seemed to tilt, light fragmented in shards across stained glass panels. Every sound, the scratch of quills, the murmur of voices, the soft footfalls of pages being turned, resonated with a surreal weight. A colleague leaned across the bench. "My lord, are you unwell?" His voice was low, polite, carefully measured. "I am fine," the Duke whispered, though the words trembled along with his hand. He could not prevent a faint sigh from escaping. He looked down at the ink blot on his ledger, a symbol of the control he was losing. Minutes stretched like hours. His pulse raced beneath his coat, catching faintly against the fabric. The speech he had rehearsed so meticulously swirled through his mind, fragments of sentences and arguments collapsing into incoherence. He tried to speak, tried to present his thoughts with clarity, but every syllable faltered, every gesture betrayed him. The ether called to him from beneath his waistcoat pocket, small, cold, and promising relief. A taste could steady his trembling, restore the rhythm of his pulse. But even that temporary balm came with its own cost, sharper tremors when the effect faded, a hollow clarity that mocked him with each passing minute. The session continued. The Duke remained seated, quill clutched weakly in one hand, hands shaking visibly, mask intact, but cracking. Colleagues murmured excuses for him, whispered assurances that he would be better after a brief rest. No one spoke of the substance. No one acknowledged the vulnerability of the strongest, most commanding presence in the room. And outside, the city continued unaware. London's morning sun reflected across cobblestones, servants carried messages, and society's grand engine hummed along. Inside the chamber, however, the Duke of Kent's hands shook, a quiet testament to the subtle, insidious influence that could undo even the most disciplined among them. An invisible poison, cradled delicately in a small glass vial. The study at Ashcombe Manor was hushed that afternoon, heavy with the scent of parchment, polished wood, and the faint trace of lavender from the mistress's reticule. Dr. Harriman Finch had been summoned under the pretense of routine consultation, yet the flicker in his eyes betrayed the urgency he concealed behind his calm, measured demeanor. He closed the door softly behind him and let the quiet settle, thick and expectant, before speaking. "Lady Ashcombe," he began, voice low, deliberate. "I must be frank." Lady Ashcombe, seated gracefully on the edge of her chaise, inclined her head. Her hands were folded demurely, but beneath the lace of her gloves, her fingers trembled faintly, a subtle, insistent shiver that the doctor had observed for months now. She inhaled delicately, masking the faint scent of ether lingering on her breath. Dr. Finch folded his hands atop his lap. "The substance you have been relying upon, ether, cannot be taken indefinitely without consequence." She blinked, maintaining a composed exterior. "I assure you, doctor, I follow your guidance precisely." He leaned forward slightly, the faint shadow of concern deepening the lines around his eyes. "Your adherence to measured doses does not account for the cumulative effect. The tremors, the pallor, the fainting at social events, these are early manifestations. They indicate your nervous system is under duress beyond what you can perceive." Lady Ashcombe's voice remained soft. "And yet, it steadies me." "Yes," Dr. Finch admitted. "In the short term it grants composure, clarity, even courage in public. But you are trading one kind of fragility for another one, less visible, yet more insidious. The body and mind begin to rely on the chemical intervention rather than your own fortitude." She pressed her gloved hands against her lap, the tremor catching faintly beneath the fabric. A delicate sigh escaped her. "And what would you have me do, doctor? Withdraw? Retreat from society entirely?" He shook his head gently. "I am aware of your obligations, Lady Ashcombe, but I must advise caution. The effects of prolonged ether use are cumulative. They may begin with slight memory lapses, tremors, irregular heartbeat, insomnia, and progress quietly, imperceptibly, until the mind becomes disjointed from the body. Your reputation, your social standing, your very health are all at risk." Clara, stationed silently by the door, watched her mistress with growing unease. She had known the signs, fainting spells, sleepless nights, erratic tremors, but hearing them articulated in measured tones lent the danger a weight she had not imagined. Lady Ashcombe nodded slowly. Her eyes flickered toward the window, where pale light illuminated the damp garden below. "I understand," she murmured. "But to step away now, it would ruin everything. My family, our standing, the household." Dr. Finch's gaze softened, though his worry did not wane. "I recognize the impossibility of withdrawing entirely, Lady Ashcombe. Yet there are measures you might take to mitigate risk. Reduced exposure in public, gradual tapering where feasible, careful monitoring of dose frequency, and the presence of a trusted observer to note subtle changes before they become overt." Her lips pressed together, the faintest sheen of perspiration glimmering on her brow. "And if I cannot follow these precautions?" she asked softly, almost in a whisper. The doctor's face darkened, though his voice remained gentle. "Then the consequences will be inevitable. The signs will grow more pronounced. Social appearances will no longer suffice to hide what is occurring within, and when society notices, it will be too late to reclaim your standing." Lady Ashcombe's gloved hands tightened against one another. She swallowed, forcing composure. "I appreciate your honesty, doctor, truly, but the world demands more than caution. It demands perfection." Dr. Finch inclined his head, understanding the impossibility of the balance she sought. "Very well, Lady Ashcombe. Take heed of these words as a warning. And remember, the smallest tremor, the slightest lapse, may herald a cascade that cannot be halted." He rose quietly, gathering his coat, and departed through the half-open door, leaving the room in a muted silence. Clara approached, noting the delicate shake in her mistress's hands. Lady Ashcombe's eyes flickered toward the reticule once more, and for a heartbeat, Clara saw the sharp pull of temptation, of relief, of control, of escape, beckoning her from within the silk folds. The warning had been delivered. But whether it would be heeded or drowned beneath the sweet, shimmering veil of ether remained uncertain. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The garden behind Ashcombe Manor lay cloaked in the muted light of an overcast afternoon. Dew clung stubbornly to the rose bushes, making each petal glisten like delicate jewels. Gravel paths wound gracefully through clipped hedges, leading to a fountain whose trickling water offered the faintest whisper of serenity. It should have been a haven, a place to breathe, to find composure. But on this particular day, it became the scene of quiet calamity. Lady Ashcombe walked the paths slowly, her silk gown brushing the damp gravel. She carried herself with practiced elegance, as though the polished movements of her body could ward off the tremors that threatened to betray her. Clara followed a few steps behind, shawl in hand, vigilant, ever watchful. Even the faintest sign of weakness might tip the balance. The morning had been unremarkable, so unremarkable that Lady Ashcombe had insisted on fresh air, despite the overcast sky. Yet the ether she had taken earlier pulsed softly through her veins, subtle but insistent. Each inhalation brought relief, but also a slow, creeping fog that clouded her equilibrium. The world swayed gently beneath her feet. The gravel crunched too loudly under her slippers. The scent of wet roses was too sharp. The fountains trickled too insistent. A sudden gust of wind swept through the garden, bending the branches of the clipped hedges. Lady Ashcombe's gloved hands fluttered involuntarily. She steadied herself against a low stone balustrade, exhaling sharply. The tremor had returned with a persistence that even Clara's watchful presence could not entirely suppress. "My lady?" Clara's voice was soft, almost tentative. "Perhaps we should return indoors?" "No," Lady Ashcombe replied, though her tone wavered slightly. I need the air." She continued walking, careful to place each foot deliberately on the gravel, but the garden shifted beneath her. The mist hanging low between the hedges seemed to curl and twist, swallowing familiar pathways and transforming them into something unfamiliar. Her vision blurred at the edges. The bench she intended to use for rest appeared twice, then disappeared entirely. Her hand trembled as she brushed a stray petal from her sleeve, leaving a faint stain red and unmistakable against the pale silk. Clara's pace quickened beside her, ready to support her mistress. "My lady, please, slow down. The ground is uneven." But Lady Ashcombe was already swaying. A sharp dip in the path, a slight indentation in the gravel caused her to stumble. Her reticule swung dangerously, the bottle inside clinking faintly. The ether scent intensified around her, sweet and metallic, filling her nostrils. Her pulse raced. The tremor surged through her body, no longer subtle. Her knees threatened to give. Clara lunged forward just as Lady Ashcombe's foot slipped on a patch of wet gravel. The mistress collapsed onto the path, silk pooling around her like a pale wave. She exhaled sharply, eyes wide, hands clutching the damp stones for balance. "My lady!" Clara cried, kneeling beside her. She lifted one arm to steady Lady Ashcombe, pressing her hands gently against her shoulders. The collapse was brief, but intense. Lady Ashcombe's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Her hands shook violently, even as she pressed them to her chest. The world around her, the roses, the fountain, the mist tilted and spun, as if the garden itself were aware of her vulnerability. Clara's heart pounded. She called softly for servants while holding her mistress steady, her eyes catching the glimmer of the vial nestled in the reticule against her mistress's side. One small sip could calm the tremor, restore composure, but it would deepen dependence, draw another thread tighter into the invisible web that had begun to ensnare Lady Ashcombe. Footsteps hurried along the gravel. 2 footmen arrived, glancing at the collapsed lady with the practiced concern of those accustomed to crises that must never become public spectacle. They assisted Clara in lifting her gently to a nearby bench, where Lady Ashcombe's body sagged with exhaustion and tension. The tremor persisted, faintly, stubbornly. She exhaled, trying to steady her pulse, to steady her hands, to steady her thoughts. The garden, with its serene hedges and gentle fountain, offered no comfort. The world was both too soft and too sharp, a contradiction impossible to reconcile without aid. Clara's eyes met her mistress's. She saw fear, acknowledgement, and something else, desperation thinly veiled beneath a mask of composure. Lady Ashcombe's hand twitched toward the reticule. Clara caught it, holding it firmly, knowing the smallest lapse could return the tremor in full force. The afternoon sun hid behind clouds, casting muted shadows over the fallen petals and wet gravel. The garden remained beautiful, silent, indifferent, and Lady Ashcombe, trembling on the bench, understood with stark clarity that ether had carried her to this moment. It had guided her, steadied her, and now left her precariously balanced on the edge of collapse, one misstep from shattering entirely. The hallways of Ashcombe Manor were unusually still that evening, the kind of silence that presses against the ears, heavy with expectation and the faint hum of hidden activity. The servants moved through the corridors with measured steps, faces composed, voices hushed. They had long ago learned the rules: observe everything, speak nothing, act only when necessary. But lately, the instructions had taken on a weight far greater than decorum required. Now, silence was not just polite, it was imperative. Clara led the small team of maids and footmen with quiet authority, each gesture deliberate, each glance meaningful. They had learned to recognize the signs tremors in Lady Ashcombe's hands, the faint shimmer of her pupils, the sweet, metallic scent that clung to her breath, her gloves, her skirts. They had witnessed small collapses, subtle lapses in memory, and the ritualized withdrawals to the boudoir. And above all, they had learned the most important rule of all: the evidence must never reach the eyes of society. Tonight, the evidence was particularly abundant. A small glass vial had slipped from Lady Ashcombe's reticule during her afternoon walk in the garden. It had rolled under a chaise lounge in the drawing-room, clinking faintly against the polished wood. Clara had seen it first, the subtle glimmer of wax against crystal-clear liquid. She knelt swiftly, retrieving the bottle with gloved hands, hiding it within her apron as if she carried a sacred artifact. "Quickly," she whispered to the younger maid, who nodded, eyes wide and fearful. No one must know. They moved silently, each aware that a single misstep could ruin everything. The bottle was placed in the service wing, locked in a drawer beneath spare linens. The sweet scent lingered faintly, a ghost hovering over the polished floorboards. Clara dabbed at it with a damp cloth, though she knew the odor could not be fully erased. It would remain, subtle and insidious, like a memory embedded in the walls. Meanwhile, a folded handkerchief stained from the ether spilled from a glove was collected from the parlor floor. Another maid, quivering slightly, had nearly left it behind, but Clara's sharp eye caught it. She instructed the girl to burn it later in the hearth of the servants' hall, ensuring no trace remained for the eyes of Lady Ashcombe's children, her husband, or any visiting guest. Footmen, equally cautious, secured letters and personal papers from Lady Ashcombe's study, noting the subtle tremors in her signature and the faint smudges on the ink. Each piece of evidence, no matter how small, had potential to reveal the truth behind the lady's composure, and all of it was now confined to shadows, hidden from prying eyes. As they worked, Clara's thoughts returned to the mistress, seated in the boudoir, with a trembling hand pressed lightly to her chest. The ether had steadied her for now, but the tremor persisted beneath the surface. The servants understood that the smallest lapse, an unguarded hand, a mislaid vial, A careless whisper could unravel weeks of careful concealment. They moved like ghosts through the hallways, extinguishing candles, smoothing carpets, arranging objects back into perfect symmetry. Their labor was quiet, invisible, but unrelenting. Every action was measured, every gesture deliberate, every breath controlled. By the time the household had settled into evening quiet, the evidence was gone. The vial, the stained glove, the misplaced papers, all vanished from sight, locked, burned, or otherwise hidden. Not a trace remained for outsiders to see. The house appeared pristine, orderly, composed. Society would perceive nothing amiss. But Clara knew the truth. The house was a facade. The mistress's world was unraveling quietly, invisibly, beneath the veneer of propriety. The servants had done their duty, yes, but only to delay the inevitable, only to obscure the slow, creeping ruin that had begun in the shadows of silk and lace. The corridor lights dimmed. The manor seemed to exhale. Silence settled like a heavy curtain. The servants retreated to their quarters, exhausted yet vigilant. And somewhere in the stillness, Clara understood the cruelest truth. No matter how diligently they hid the evidence, nothing could halt the quiet, inexorable erosion of a life consumed by ether. The portrait had been commissioned at great expense, painted by one of London's most renowned artists, a man whose brush captured every curve of silk, every glimmer of pearl, every subtle flush of skin. It was intended to immortalize Lady Ashcombe in her prime, a figure of poise, elegance, and refined beauty. The canvas now hung in the grand hall, lit by the soft glow of gas lamps that shimmered like captured stars. Visitors admired it, whispering praise for the delicate details, the folds of her gown, the subtlety of her jewelry, the expression of calm authority on her pale, perfect face. But the image, flawless as it appeared, told a truth no guest could perceive. The lady in the portrait was not the woman who moved through the manor below. Lady Ashcombe paused before the canvas, her reflection caught in the glass over the painting. She studied the painted eyes, soft brown, composed, dignified, and traced them with a gloved fingertip, imagining that behind those eyes lay the Lady Ashcombe she remembered from a week, a month, a year ago. The version of herself who had laughed freely, who had held her children without fear, who had walked through society unshaken by the hidden tremors that now racked her body. But that lady was gone. She inhaled sharply, the faint scent of ether lingering from the reticule at her side. Her hands trembled subtly, almost imperceptibly beneath the lace gloves. She pressed them together, forcing them to still, but the quiver persisted, an echo of the substance's insidious hold. Each small movement betrayed the tension beneath her veneer of composure, revealing a fragility that no powder, no dress, no smile could conceal. The portrait had frozen her at the apex of elegance, immortalized in oil and canvas, yet it could not protect her from the erosion unfolding beneath. She felt the weight of her own reflection, the impossibility of reconciling the painted perfection with the trembling reality. The room around her seemed too quiet, the lamps casting shadows that flickered like whispered accusations on the walls. Clara hovered discreetly near the doorway, observing her mistress. She had long ago learned the subtle signals, the slight tilt of the head, the delicate flutter of eyelids, the faint contraction of the jaw. Each indicated the battle Lady Ashcombe fought daily against the tremor, against the cravings, against the creeping fear that her life might unravel quietly, invisibly, behind closed doors. Clara's heart ached with knowledge, the truth heavier for being unspoken. Lady Ashcombe turned her gaze from the portrait to the floor, the fine pattern of the carpet shimmering faintly in the gaslight. She could hear the faint clink of the ether vial within her reticule, a reminder that control was only temporary. She swallowed, attempting composure, yet the tremor caught her hand again as she lifted a fan to her face. The silence was complete. Even the distant murmur of the city beyond the manor walls seemed swallowed by the weight of her unsteady breath. For a moment, she imagined the painted Lady Ashcombe stepping down from the canvas, gliding across the floor to offer steadiness she could no longer summon herself. But the painted figure remained frozen, eternal, perfect, and unattainable. Clara approached, hesitant, offering a soft word of reassurance. "My lady." Lady Ashcombe turned slowly, forcing her lips into a faint, polite smile that barely concealed the ache within. "Clara, see that everything is prepared for dinner," she said, her voice measured, though her pulse raced beneath the fine silk of her gown. "And see that the children are occupied." Clara nodded, sensing the tremor beneath the mask of command. She retreated to carry out her instructions, leaving Lady Ashcombe alone once more before the canvas. The portrait loomed silently. It captured her at her best, her composure flawless, her expression serene. Yet as Lady Ashcombe stared at it, she felt a hollow ache, an unspoken acknowledgement that the woman within, the one who had once possessed steadiness and strength, was unmade. The elegance remained, the outward perfection preserved for society's gaze, but the interior had begun to crumble, quietly, irreversibly, beneath the delicate, relentless grasp of ether. She exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her chest, the tremor catching faintly beneath her gloves. The painted Lady Ashcombe would endure forever. She herself, real, trembling, human, was slowly dissolving into shadow and silence, a life half-lived in the service of appearances and the fleeting comfort of a sweet, crystalline poison. The grand hall of the auction house in Mayfair smelled of polished oak, candle wax, and the faint tang of damp paper. Rows of mahogany chairs stretched before a raised platform, where the auctioneer's hammer gleamed under the flickering gaslights. It was a room designed to impress, designed to make wealth tangible and legacy malleable, bought and sold with a single stroke of a gavel. Tonight, it was silent, save for the hushed murmurs of those few who had been permitted to attend. The Ashcombe estate was on display. Every item of value, every artifact of refinement and prestige had been consigned. Paintings, gilded mirrors, delicate porcelain vases, silverware polished to a reflective shine, and volumes of leather-bound books that smelled faintly of history and memory all lined the walls and tables of the auction hall. Even the portrait of Lady Ashcombe, painted at the height of her elegance, had been removed from the grand hall of the manor and positioned for all to see. Its eyes, eternal and judgmental, seemed to observe the proceedings silently, a reminder of the life slipping away behind the veneer of wealth. Lady Ashcombe sat in a corner, masked in a gown of deep emerald silk. The folds of her dress shimmered in the muted lamplight, but beneath the elegance, her hands trembled, tiny, insistent movements that betrayed her reliance on the sweet, crystalline relief of ether. Clara sat nearby, gloved hands pressed tightly in her lap, eyes darting between her mistress and the moving figures of the auction. Both knew that every item passing from the household into the hands of strangers carried more than monetary value. It carried fragments of their lives, whispered memories, and the faint scent of a world that no longer belonged to them. The auctioneer's voice rang out, precise and formal. Lot 1, a collection of silver candelabras from Ashcombe Manor. Opening bid, £500. His hammer gleamed as he lifted it, and the room shivered with anticipation. Bids rose slowly, carefully, until the candelabras were sold. Then came the books, the vases, the tapestries, each item fetching sums that would have seemed impossible to Lady Ashcombe when she had first set them in their rightful places. And yet the highest bids carried an air of indifference, as though the buyers were acquiring not only objects, but the stories and secrets they concealed. When the portrait of Lady Ashcombe was brought forward, a hush fell across the hall. The painted eyes seemed to glimmer faintly beneath the lamplight, capturing the attention of everyone present. Each brushstroke, each soft hue, betrayed an ideal never truly attainable. The auctioneer announced the starting bid, and hands went up quickly. The hammer fell, and the portrait passed into new hands, forever removed from the halls it had once watched silently over. Lady Ashcombe exhaled, pressing a gloved hand to her chest. The tremor had not ceased. Her eyes flicked to Clara, who understood immediately. The auction had taken more than objects, it had stripped away control, dignity, and the carefully maintained illusion of normalcy. The remaining items continued to pass, one by one, until nothing of consequence remained. Every silver spoon, every lace-trimmed handkerchief, every delicate figurine had been claimed, carried away by strangers who did not know the weight of the lives attached to them. The ether that had coursed through the halls of Ashcombe Manor, that had steadied trembling hands, that had made composure possible during whispered crises, now seemed to linger invisibly over the empty spaces, a spectral residue marking absence and loss. As the final gavel fell, Lady Ashcombe rose, her legs weak beneath the weight of her gown. She did not speak. She did not move toward the exit. Instead, she allowed the silence to enfold her, heavy and absolute. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, soft and unyielding, swallowing the carriage wheels and muffling footsteps. Clara followed her mistress silently, hands clutching the empty space where once there had been legacy, warmth, and security. The house, emptied of its treasures, felt hollow, its walls echoing faintly with the memory of life once lived in luxury and order. And Lady Ashcombe understood, with the bitter clarity only such an evening could provide, that some losses could never be recovered, not by wealth, not by care, not even by the fleeting, crystalline comfort of ether. The auction had taken everything that could be bought and sold, but it had left something far more devastating behind, the quiet, unyielding erosion of a life that had been carefully constructed, now slowly, irrevocably, unmade. The widow had grown accustomed to shadows. Widowhood, she understood, was a life measured in silences and the slow tick of a mantel clock, each second marking absence as acutely as presence once had. She sat at the window of her small townhouse across the square, a shawl draped over her shoulders, the lamp beside her flickering faintly as dusk deepened into night. Outside, the gas lamps cast long, wavering columns of light across the cobblestones, illuminating the occasional passer-by, the distant clatter of carriage wheels, the soft, insistent press of London fog curling around every corner. Her gaze, however, did not linger on the streets. It settled on Ashcombe Manor, perched at the edge of the square like a jewel, its windows glowing softly through the mist. She had observed the household for months now, noting patterns invisible to others, the late-night carriage departures, the tremors of a hand glimpsed in passing, the hurried consultations with physicians whose eyes always carried an unspoken weight. Tonight, the widow watched as Lady Ashcombe appeared in the drawing-room window, pale in the glow of the gaslight. Her gown shimmered faintly, a cascade of soft green silk that moved almost imperceptibly as she crossed the room. Even from across the square, the widow could see the subtle tremor in her mistress's hands, the slight flutter against a teacup, the way she pressed a gloved finger against her chest, as though trying to still the pulse beneath. The widow's heart constricted. She remembered her own husband, now gone, and the fragility of life beneath the thin veneer of wealth and propriety. She had seen that fragility destroy families quietly, invisibly, and she knew intuitively that Lady Ashcombe was on a path that mirrored the tragedies she had witnessed before. The ether, that crystalline poison dressed in the guise of composure, had woven itself into her life with the subtlety of a shadow. Clara appeared beside Lady Ashcombe, moving silently, and the widow could see the careful gestures, the watchful eyes. The maid carried herself like a guardian of secrets, understanding the stakes of the mistress's trembling, the peril that lurked beneath a facade of poise. The widow recognized the dynamic instantly. She had seen similar patterns during the long months of her own bereavement. Servants who shielded, hid, and cajoled, while the wealthy masters of houses teetered on invisible edges. A carriage drew up briefly at the front door of the manor, horses stamping impatiently, yet Lady Ashcombe did not move toward it. Instead, she lingered in the room, hands clasped over the reticule where the ether bottle rested, shoulders slightly slumped, head tilted in a posture that balanced elegance and frailty. The widow traced the silhouette of her figure against the faint lamplight, noting the subtle curve of fatigue beneath the gown, the stiffness in the neck, the quivering that even powder could not disguise. The widow drew a slow breath. She knew, as any who had witnessed similar declines did, that the public would see only what was offered to view: grace, composure, wealth, and an unshakable facade. They would not see the trembling hands behind the gloves, the unsteady pulse beneath the bodice, or the faint trace of sweetness lingering in the air, like a secret no one dared name. As the shadows lengthened, Lady Ashcombe moved to the window, pressing one delicate hand against the glass. The widow imagined the thoughts coursing through her mind, calculations of appearances, memories of gentility, the quiet dread of a dependence that no mirror, no gown, no smile could ever fully conceal. The widow turned from the window only reluctantly. She lit a small candle and leaned back, fingers interlaced over her lap. Across the square, the Ashcombe estate continued its quiet, deliberate unravelling. Each tremor, each shadow, each whisper of ether, marking the slow collapse of a life once polished to perfection. And the widow watched, silent, helpless, but unflinchingly aware, knowing that in the quiet, the invisible tragedies of the affluent were often the most profound, and that nothing, not even wealth, could stem the tide that had already begun. Little Marianne Ashcombe sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, a stack of embroidered dolls lined neatly before her, each one dressed in miniature gowns and bonnets, their tiny hands clasped in imitation of her own. The afternoon sun filtered faintly through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like suspended stars in the muted light. To any observer, she appeared calm, composed, quietly engaged in play. But beneath the surface, her mind churned with a heavy awareness far beyond her 9 years. She had learned too soon that the world could be fragile, that appearances were a tenuous veil hiding a deeper, harsher reality. In the past weeks, she had observed her mother, Lady Ashcombe, with a clarity she had not been meant to possess, trembling hands that were always carefully folded behind lace gloves, sudden lapses in memory, fainting spells, the subtle shimmer of a sweet chemical scent that accompanied her mother through the halls of the manor. Marianne had learned to note these things quietly, to catalogue them in a child's mind without naming them aloud, without alarming those around her. Henry, her younger brother, had grown similarly perceptive. He knelt beside his toy soldiers, arranging them in precise lines, his small face pinched in concentration. He whispered instructions to the tiny figures, though Marianne knew he was also whispering to himself to keep order in a world where so much had already become unsteady. Their governess, Mrs. Talbot, watched from her chair near the window, knitting, though her eyes flicked too often toward the children and then toward the corridor. She had begun to understand the delicate balance they all maintained, the careful choreography of safety, secrecy, and the concealment of fear. Marianne glanced toward the nursery door. Beyond it, she knew, Lady Ashcombe paced in the drawing-room, her reticule clutched at her side, the small ether vial inside a hidden anchor for the tremor that haunted her hands. The mistress of the house moved like a marionette, each step measured, each gesture precise, yet every movement betrayed the invisible strain beneath. Marianne had seen her mother collapse in the garden, seen Clara's quick intervention, and observed the subtle ritual of the bottle being retrieved, tilted, and inhaled. "Marianne?" Henry's voice broke through her thoughts. "Will Mama be okay?" She hesitated, the weight of knowledge pressing down on her small shoulders. She's fine," Marianne whispered, though the words lacked conviction. She could feel the tremor in her mother's world, a rhythm that could not be silenced. We just have to be quiet. Very quiet. Henry nodded solemnly, understanding more than he should have. Even at 6, he recognized the unspoken rules: not to draw attention, not to alarm, not to disturb. Their play became quieter, movements deliberate, voices soft. The doll's hands clasped more tightly. The toy soldiers marched in silence. Every action in the nursery was measured against an invisible standard of secrecy imposed by a mother who could no longer protect herself entirely. Clara appeared quietly at the doorway, observing the children. She was the only adult who truly understood the weight they carried, and she softened her gaze, knowing that no comfort could erase the lessons the children had learned. Marianne's eyes met hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, that the world outside was not entirely safe, that even the most beautiful and seemingly powerful could falter, and that some truths must be carried silently, too heavy for the young to share aloud. The light waned as the afternoon passed. Marianne tucked a doll carefully into its tiny bed, straightened Henry's soldiers, and whispered, "We must stay quiet, always quiet." And as the shadows lengthened across the nursery floor, she understood fully that her childhood had ended in an instant, replaced by a vigilance and comprehension no child should bear, a knowledge of fragility, fear, and the quiet, relentless power of ether that had begun to unravel the household they had once believed untouchable. The attic at Ashcombe Manor had always been a place of quiet shadows and forgotten relics. Its sloping beams were darkened by age, and the floorboards groaned softly beneath careful steps. Dust hung thickly in the corners, settling over old trunks, stacks of disused furniture, and boxes of linens that had not seen the light of day for decades. Few ventured here, for the air carried the weight of memories and the scent of neglect. But tonight, it held something else entirely: secrecy, deliberate and consuming. Lady Ashcombe moved silently along the narrow walkway, her silk slippers muffled by the thin rug she had unrolled from a chest. The tremor in her hands had returned, faint but insistent, betraying her even as she pressed them to the rail of the stairs to steady herself. Clara followed closely, eyes alert, ready to intervene. The flicker of candlelight from a single lamp revealed the sharp planes of Lady Ashcombe's face, cheekbones dusted lightly with powder, lips pressed firmly, eyes wide and alert. The ether still lingered in her system, a quiet hum beneath the pulse of her veins, guiding each step but demanding more. At the far end of the attic, behind an inconspicuous panel that had been mistaken for part of the wall, Lady Ashcombe paused. Her gloved hands trembled as she lifted the latch. The panel swung inward with a quiet creak, revealing a narrow room beyond a place she had constructed in secret, hidden for years from the eyes of guests, servants, and even her husband. The walls were lined with shelves, meticulously arranged, holding small bottles, folded letters, and objects of personal significance. Here, the ether was stored safely, discreetly, concealed beneath folds of silk and velvet. Clara knelt to steady a bottle that teetered slightly on its shelf. "My lady, are you certain you should be—" "Shh," Lady Ashcombe whispered, cutting her off. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the neat rows of vials, the carefully labeled containers. This was her refuge, her control, the one place where the tremor of her hands could be managed, where the sweet relief of ether could be accessed without the prying eyes of society, without whispers trailing after her every movement. The room smelled faintly of lavender, mixed with the sharp, crystalline tang of the ether. Candles flickered on the small table at the center, illuminating the glimmering surfaces of glass bottles. Each one held a promise of calm, a temporary mastery over a body and mind that had begun to unravel. She reached for a vial with a steady hand, despite the faint shiver running up her arm, uncorking it carefully and inhaling just enough to still the tremor that had grown sharper during the climb to the attic. Clara watched silently, knowing that even the slightest hesitation could draw attention to the mistress's dependency. The hidden room was a sanctuary, yes, but also a prison. Every bottle, every secret letter, every piece of folded silk was a tether to a fragile stability maintained by deception and chemical comfort. Here, Lady Ashcombe ruled with absolute control, yet that control was an illusion, delicate as the glass she handled so carefully. She placed the vial back into its padded shelf and surveyed the room. Objects of beauty and utility were intertwined with necessity and indulgence. Letters from acquaintances, carefully folded and marked, lay alongside perfume bottles and small tokens from social gatherings, now tinged with memories she could not bear to face openly. The room was her private theatre, where she enacted control over a life, slowly dissolving beneath appearances. Clara rose to stand behind her mistress. "Shall we return, my lady?" Lady Ashcombe nodded, but paused to glance back at the rows of bottles, at the small shimmering prisms of safety and danger, intermingled. "Yes," she whispered softly, "but remember, no one must ever know." They closed the panel carefully, masking it as a part of the wall once more. The tremor lingered faintly in her hands as they descended, but the hidden room remained intact, a secret refuge and a silent witness to the inexorable unraveling of Lady Ashcombe's carefully constructed world. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows of the manor, thick and impenetrable, as if shielding the household from the prying eyes of a society that could not yet comprehend the depths of its mistress's fragile, hidden life. The ballroom of Ashcombe Manor was larger than most in London, a vaulted space filled with mirrors, gilded cornices, and a chandelier whose crystals scattered light like fractured rainbows. It had been polished to a reflective brilliance, the parquet floor waxed until it gleamed, and the air scented with jasmine and rosewater, mingling faintly with the heady aroma of wine brought up from the cellar. On ordinary nights, this room was alive with movement, laughter, and music that lifted the spirits of all who attended. But tonight, it was hollow. Guests arrived in their finest attire, but their steps were careful, muted, hesitant. Whispers filled the corners, the way shadows press against walls, discussing Lady Ashcombe with polite circumspection. They observed her, yes, but with a wary eye, noting the slight tremor in her wrist as she accepted bows and curtsies, the uneven rhythm of her pulse beneath the lace of her gloves, the faint shimmer of chemical sweetness clinging to her gown. Clara followed silently behind her mistress, aware that the eyes of all present were subtly drawn to Lady Ashcombe, though no one dared speak aloud the truth of what they had begun to suspect. The mistress's composure was fragile, maintained by the ether hidden in her reticule, yet her tremor betrayed her in the most delicate of ways. A brush of fingers, a subtle sway, a glance, too quick, too bright. The orchestra began to play, the strings lifting with careful precision, but the notes felt fractured. The tempo seemed too slow, too fast, too uncertain, caught in the subtle influence of the mistress's own unsteady perception. Lady Ashcombe stepped into the center of the room, poised and elegant, and for a moment the world held its breath. But the guests did not move. At first, the stillness was polite. They nodded, bowed, smiled, but did not take partners. They lingered in place, chairs too upright, fans clutched nervously, hands twisting gloves in anxious mimicry of composure. Conversations died in their throats, replaced by a quiet tension that crept across the polished floor like mist. The sparkle of gowns and polished shoes seemed dimmer, as if the very light of the room feared to illuminate what lay beneath. Lady Ashcombe's gaze swept over the crowd, noting the hesitation, the reluctance, the fear pressed thin beneath practiced manners. She forced a smile, raised a hand to the nearest gentleman, and gestured toward the floor. "Shall we begin?" No one responded. Her pulse quickened. The tremor in her hand grew sharper. A bead of sweat formed at her temple. She pressed her gloved fingers to her lips, inhaling softly, tasting the faint remnants of ether that had kept her upright, but only barely. She tried again. "It is a waltz, do let us dance." A polite cough answered her, a shuffle of feet, but no movement followed. Guests averted their eyes, lingering in clusters near the walls, as though the floor itself might betray them if they stepped forward. The music continued, sweet and flowing, but it seemed to stretch indefinitely, a sound without motion, a rhythm without release. Lady Ashcombe's breath came quickly. Her hand pressed again to the reticule, fingers brushing the vial, feeling the cool glass beneath silk. She took a measured sip, inhaled, exhaled, and tried once more to summon the elegance, the command, the authority she had always carried. Yet the room remained still. The mirrors reflected the frozen figures of those assembled, their eyes wide with unspoken dread, their hands clenched, their smiles brittle. Lady Ashcombe's own reflection seemed unfamiliar, distorted by the tremor she could no longer entirely mask. She realized then, with a pang of horror, that the evening would not unfold as it should, that the veneer of propriety had cracked too deeply. And so, the chandelier sparkled down upon a room of still bodies and silent whispers, a ballroom full of motionless guests who dared not dance, and a lady at its center whose every breath, every tremor, every sip of ether spoke silently of a world quietly, inexorably unraveling. The night would be remembered not for the waltzes played, but for the silence, the stillness, and the haunting realization that even beauty, wealth, and etiquette could not restore what was lost beneath lace, silk, and crystalline poison. The house felt different that evening, quieter, heavier, as though the walls themselves were aware of the absence. Lady Ashcombe moved through the halls with a fragile composure, her steps measured, her gown brushing softly against the polished floors. Clara followed silently, eyes alert, noting the tremor in her mistress's hands, the faint glimmer of fear that lingered in her pupils. The ether had been administered earlier, yet the tremor persisted, insistent as a pulse beneath silk and lace. Dr. Harriman Finch had not arrived. His absence was deliberate, though unspoken. For weeks, his presence had been a quiet tether, a steadying hand upon the edges of Lady Ashcombe's unraveling life. His visits had been short, discreet, precise, an inhalation of authority, a prescription of calm. Now, the silence left in his stead was palpable, stretching through corridors and drawing rooms like a shadow with its own weight. Lady Ashcombe paused before a window, looking out onto the fog-shrouded garden. The world beyond seemed muted, flattened, the lamplight refracted through mist. She pressed a gloved hand to the glass, feeling the cold seep through the fabric, a faint echo of the cold she carried within. Without the doctor's quiet presence, she felt unmoored, adrift in a world that required vigilance she could no longer fully muster. Clara approached cautiously. "My lady, shall I prepare your boudoir? Perhaps it would be best to retire early tonight." Lady Ashcombe turned slowly, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "No, Clara, I will not retire yet. There are letters to attend to, business to manage." Her voice wavered faintly despite her efforts. "He would have reminded me to rest, I suppose, but he is otherwise engaged." The remark hung in the air, both true and untrue. Dr. Finch had his duties, of course, but Lady Ashcombe knew that even when he was absent, he remained a silent presence in her mind, a cautionary voice she now missed with an aching clarity. Without him, the tremor was sharper, the pulse irregular, the air heavy with anticipation and fear. She moved toward the writing desk in the drawing room, hands shaking slightly as she unfolded a letter, the handwriting blurred before her eyes. She exhaled sharply, gripping the edges of the paper until her knuckles whitened. Clara, watching silently, dared not speak. Her role had evolved into one of careful observation, noting each subtle sign of fatigue, each flicker of tremor, each fleeting lapse in composure. The house itself seemed to lean closer, walls creaking softly, the floorboards murmuring beneath their weight. Lady Ashcombe's breath came faster, uneven, catching in the throat that had grown dry from the ether's lingering sweetness. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the pulse beneath the silk gown, a pulse that now throbbed with a faint panic, untempered by the reassurance that the doctor's presence had always provided. Clara stepped closer, gently placing a hand atop her mistress's trembling one. "My lady." Lady Ashcombe turned to her, eyes wide, pupils reflecting the lamplight in a shimmer of fear and exhaustion. She forced a smile, but it was brittle, fragile. "I am well," she murmured. Yet even she knew it was a lie. The absence of Dr. Finch was not merely a missed visit. It was the quiet acknowledgement that Lady Ashcombe must navigate the world without her anchor, that she must face the tremors, the dependencies, the creeping erosion of composure alone. And in that realization, the house seemed to tighten around her, pressing with the weight of silence, expectation, and unspoken dread. Evening settled fully over Ashcombe Manor. The lamps cast long shadows across empty hallways. In the drawing-room, Lady Ashcombe sat with hands clasped tightly, the tremor still whispering beneath her gloves. Clara remained close, watching, vigilant, understanding that the night had shifted. The doctor had stopped coming, and with his absence, the fragile scaffolding that had maintained her mistress's grace began to sway, the quiet, unravelling growing bolder with every passing moment. The city was waking slowly that morning, the fog still clinging to the rooftops like a veil, the cobblestones slick with a night's lingering mist. London's inhabitants moved along their familiar routes, unaware of the subtle tremors rippling through the upper echelons of society. But the whisper had begun soft, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The scandal that had been contained, hidden beneath the polished veneer of etiquette and secrecy, could no longer remain covered. It began at the opera. A footman, unaware of the weight of his observation, noted Lady Ashcombe's trembling hand as she curtsied before the box. He saw the faint sheen of sweat along her temple, the flicker in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and clandestine measures. The incident was minor, a pause, a misstep, but in the careful eyes of society, nothing is ever trivial. Word travelled swiftly, carried by whispered voices over tea, by the subtle glances exchanged in drawing-rooms, by polite inquiries that hid more than they revealed. The next report arrived from the Harrington ball. A gentleman spoke too loudly of Lady Ashcombe's fainting spell, a minor lapse that had been dismissed as fatigue. But the guests who overheard carried the information forward, their retellings growing slightly sharper with each iteration. By the time it reached the drawing-rooms of Mayfair, the narrative had gained substance, each whisper a thread, tightening the net around the household. Even within Ashcombe Manor, the atmosphere had shifted. Clara moved through the halls with quiet urgency, knowing that any misstep could make the whispers tangible. The children had been instructed to remain in the nursery, kept occupied with whispered lessons and soft games that required minimal movement. Footmen and maids navigated corridors with a newfound tension, their eyes constantly alert for any sign that Lady Ashcombe's composure might falter in public. The portrait in the grand hall, once a testament to elegance and grace, now seemed almost accusatory. Each observer who glanced upon it carried with them the faintest suspicion, interpreting the frozen perfection as a mask for the growing instability beneath. Even the painted eyes appeared to watch the household with judgment, silently recording the tremors, the faint gasps, the concealed bottle that had become both solace and prison. By midday, letters and messages began to arrive from acquaintances. Invitations were politely declined, inquiries veiled in courtesy but sharpened with concern. Society's gossip was now a persistent undercurrent, impossible to ignore. Lady Ashcombe, seated in her boudoir, pressed her hands against the reticule that contained the vial. The The tremor in her fingers was subtle, insistent, unrelenting. She inhaled lightly, tasting the faint chemical sweetness, attempting to regain the composure that had always been her armor. But the world would not be silenced. Even the ether, that crystalline balm, could not erase the growing murmurs. The servants could conceal the bottles, the handkerchiefs, the small traces, but they could not conceal the perception of those who had begun to notice the signs. Whispers had become statements, glances, judgments, silence, expectation. By evening, the household had grown taut with anticipation, the air heavy with a combination of dread and defiance. Lady Ashcombe moved through the corridors with careful grace, but even she knew that the careful choreography of composure could not fully contain the storm. The scandal that had been buried beneath layers of etiquette, discretion, and chemical solace had begun to rise, unstoppable in its inevitability. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, hiding the world from view, yet intensifying the sense of isolation within. Within Ashcombe Manor, the tremors persisted, faint and unyielding, as if echoing the city's growing awareness. The scandal could no longer be contained. It was here, in the hush of the drawing rooms, the hush of the servants' corridors, the hush of the children's nursery, a living, breathing thing that demanded attention and acknowledgement, waiting for the moment when even the most carefully maintained masks would fall completely away. The ledger lay open on the mahogany desk in Ashcombe Manor's study, its pages pristine save for the faint smudges of tears and ink. Every entry, once a testament to careful stewardship and orderly succession, now seemed to bleed beneath the weight of absence and neglect. Accounts that had once balanced neatly, numbers that had reflected the steady accumulation of wealth and legacy, were now irregular, imprecise, and impossibly heavy with consequence. Loss had seeped into every line, a silent contaminant no polish or discipline could erase. Lady Ashcombe entered the study, her gown of deep sapphire silk catching the lamplight, yet failing to mask the pale hue beneath her powdered cheeks. Clara followed closely, carrying the faint scent of lavender and damp wool from the chill outside. Lady Ashcombe's hands, gloved but trembling, hovered over the ledger as though its weight were physical. Each flicker of ink seemed to reflect not numbers but memories, debts, and obligations, the remnants of a life steadily unraveling beneath the delicate veneer of propriety. She opened the ledger to the first pages, running her trembling fingers over the names, the dates, the carefully recorded sums. Each entry brought the past forward, gifts given, properties acquired, investments made with the precision of a hand guided by experience and strategy. Yet now, the ledger was blotched with loss. Missed payments, hastily scribbled notes, irregular accounting, all evidence of a household increasingly dependent on concealment and secrecy to maintain appearances. Clara stood by silently, understanding the significance of what her mistress faced. The ledger was more than accounting, it was the backbone of the Ashcombe legacy, a document that preserved history, inheritance, and honor. And now it was compromised, sullied by absence, distraction, and the quiet consumption of ether that dictated Lady Ashcombe's days and nights. Each entry carried the subtle mark of tremor, a smudge where ink had bled, a number overwritten hastily, a margin note nearly illegible. The house itself seemed to watch, walls leaning in with unspoken judgment as the mistress traced her finger along the lines, lips pressed tightly together. The children's inheritance, the reputation of the family, the carefully curated image presented to society, everything was encoded within these pages. But the ledger now reflected fragility. It whispered of funds diverted to maintain appearances, of estates mortgaged quietly to pay for indulgences meant to steady a trembling hand, of the slow erosion of fortune that came not from mismanagement alone, but from a hidden, insidious dependence that no society could acknowledge. Lady Ashcombe paused, her pulse quickening despite the faint calm that ether provided. She traced a particular entry, an amount intended for charitable donation, now reduced to a fraction, the notation smudged and hastily overwritten. A pang of shame pierced her chest, deeper than the tremor, sharper than the fatigue that had settled in her bones. Even the most precise records could not hide the truth. Her reliance on ether, her absences, her faltering control, had left its mark on every aspect of her household. Clara dared not speak. She merely adjusted a lamp, letting the flickering light illuminate the pages, highlighting the tiny imperfections, the faint evidence of a life increasingly dependent on chemical solace to maintain what society believed unassailable. Lady Ashcombe leaned back in her chair, pressing her gloved hands together. The tremor persisted, faint but insistent, beneath the surface. She exhaled softly, recognizing that the ledger was a mirror of her own condition, orderly on the surface, but blotted, imperiled, and slowly unraveling from within. The city beyond the windows continued unaware, fog pressing against panes like a protective shroud, hiding the quiet disintegration within. But the ledger, blotted, smudged, and heavy with loss, was indisputable. The Ashcombe legacy, once secure and brilliant, now bore the subtle scars of dependence, secrecy, and the invisible, relentless erosion of a household held together only by appearances and the fleeting, crystalline comfort of ether. London had been patient for centuries, watching the tides of wealth, fashion, and influence flow like the Thames beneath its bridges. The city had tolerated whispers, concealed scandals, and the carefully orchestrated illusions of its elite. But even London has its limits. Even it could no longer ignore the tremors that had begun to ripple through the grand houses of Mayfair and the drawing rooms of the upper echelon. The whispers began quietly, as they always did at the opera, in candlelit parlors beneath the rustle of silk fans. A faint rumor of Lady Ashcombe's tremor here, a gentleman fainting at a banquet there, a chemist's discreet ledger carrying names that no one dared speak aloud. Each fragment was insignificant on its own, a moment too easily dismissed. But collectively, they formed a pattern. The illusion of perfection was fracturing, and society could no longer pretend it remained intact. By mid-morning, the whispers had grown louder. They were carried by the staff of townhouses, the chauffeurs who noticed the trembling hands behind lace gloves, the governesses who had watched children tiptoe around a mother they loved but feared to alarm. Even the papers' society columns, typically devoted to fashion and engagement announcements, bore subtle hints. The careful phrasing of absences, the delicate noting of fainting at gatherings, the unremarkable reporting of minor ailments that masked a deeper reality. Lady Ashcombe walked through her house with her usual poise, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her as never before. Each step was measured, deliberate, a dance with an invisible adversary. Clara followed silently, noting the faint chemical scent that lingered in the air, the soft sighs that accompanied each hesitant movement. The ether, once a discreet ally, now pulsed insistently through her mistress's veins, offering calm while deepening dependence. Outside, the city whispered louder still. Carriages slowed at Ashcombe Manor, drivers exchanging glances, their horses stamping impatiently on cobblestones slick with fog. Servants in neighboring houses paused in doorways, listening. Children playing nearby sensed the tension, feeling it in the air, though they could not name it. Every observer, from street hawkers to passing pedestrians, became part of a subtle chorus, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, that even the most polished appearances could not entirely mask the erosion taking place behind closed doors. By afternoon, the whispers became statements. Society's mask had begun to falter. Neighbours spoke too loudly at afternoon teas. Acquaintances in townhouses glanced with curiosity, noting absences and faltering movements. Invitations were declined without explanation. and when questioned, guests offered vague reassurances, their eyes betraying the unease they could not voice. London, the eternal witness, began murmuring its truth. Lady Ashcombe retreated to her boudoir, seeking the familiar solace of the ether. Yet even as she inhaled, she felt the weight of observation pressing upon her. The city's whispers were not entirely audible, but they penetrated the walls, the windows, the very air. She knew, with an unspoken certainty, that the careful construction of her household, the hidden bottles, the discreet dosing, the attendant's vigilance, was no longer sufficient. Clara approached, hands folded, knowing the moment had arrived when appearances could no longer contain reality. "My lady," she said softly, "they are speaking." Lady Ashcombe's eyes met hers, wide and luminous, pupils dilated by the ether. "Yes," she murmured, "and they will continue until all is revealed." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, soft and unyielding, yet even it could not obscure the city's recognition. The whispers, subtle at first, had become undeniable. London was awake, alert, and finally speaking the truth that had long been held beneath the surface. Within Ashcombe Manor, Lady Ashcombe's hands trembled once more, the ether's relief temporary and fragile. Society's quiet chorus pressed against her ears, mingling with the pulse of her own heartbeat, until the realization was unavoidable. No amount of composure, no amount of concealment, no measure of chemical solace could indefinitely forestall the revelation. The city had finally whispered, and the truth would no longer be contained. Dawn arrived slowly, diffused through the fog that still clung stubbornly to the streets of Mayfair. It was a pale light, weak and hesitant, casting everything in shades of grey and muted gold. The city stirred as carriages rolled over wet cobblestones, servants scurried to begin their day, and gas lamps flickered for the final time before extinguishing in favour of the sun. Outside, life resumed its ordinary rhythms, oblivious to the quiet catastrophe that had consumed Ashcombe Manor overnight. Inside, the house was heavy with absence. Chairs remained where they had been left, tables untouched, and the air carried the faint, insistent scent of ether that lingered despite the hours passed since its last use. Lady Ashcombe sat at the window in the drawing-room, her silk gown a muted reflection of the morning light, her posture erect yet frail. Her gloved hands rested on the sill, trembling faintly, a persistent reminder that her body no longer obeyed entirely the will she exerted so carefully in public. Clara stood silently behind her, eyes fixed on the faint pulse beneath the lace of her mistress's gloves, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the shallow inhalations, the tightness of her jaw. She understood, better than anyone, the weight of what had transpired over the last months, the gradual erosion of composure, the dependence on ether to maintain the illusion of perfection, the fractures hidden beneath silk, lace, and polite smiles. The house, once a testament to wealth and order, now felt like a mausoleum of illusions. The portrait gallery, the polished floors, the meticulously arranged furnishings, all remained intact, yet they seemed hollow, mere shadows of a life quietly unraveling. The ledger, blotted with loss, sat in the study, a tangible record of the household's decline, while the ether bottles, hidden meticulously in drawers and cabinets, stood as silent accomplices to the ruin. Lady Ashcombe exhaled softly, pressing a hand to her chest, as though to contain the tremor that still pulsed beneath her ribs. The sun rose slowly, illuminating the room in a cold light that rendered every imperfection sharper. The faint lines beneath her eyes, the subtle quiver in her fingers, the slight curvature of her shoulders that betrayed exhaustion. No powder, no gown, no porcelain mask could conceal the toll taken by the sweet, crystalline poison that had maintained her in public, yet slowly corroded her from within. Clara approached, offering a cup of tea, her hands steady despite her own anxiety. "My lady," she whispered, "perhaps a moment of sustenance." Lady Ashcombe's gaze lingered on the rising sun, the mist lifting slowly from the square below. She nodded faintly, taking the cup with trembling fingers, sipping carefully. The warmth of the tea offered minimal comfort, but it was an anchor, however tenuous, in a world that had shifted beneath her. She reflected briefly on the events of the past weeks. The tremors in her hands, the collapses in the garden, the failed dances, the silent whispers of society, the auction of her estate, the children learning to tread quietly around her, the city finally murmuring its recognition of the truth. Every detail had etched itself into memory, a slow, deliberate map of decline that could not be unmade. The dawn pressed against the windows, soft and insistent, as if urging the household to move forward. But Lady Ashcombe understood the permanence of what had transpired. Wealth, appearances, and social standing had been eroded in silence. Dependence had grown where strength had once resided, and society's awareness, though polite and indirect, had crystallized the reality that the household could never entirely recover from. Clara watched her mistress, hand still gently holding the cup. A faint tremor remained, persistent yet contained. Lady Ashcombe's eyes, wide and luminous, reflected the first light of day, a fragile mixture of resignation, vigilance, and unspoken fear. The manor exhaled with the morning. The city stirred outside, unaware. Inside, however, Lady Ashcombe sat poised yet frayed, elegance and fragility entwined, knowing fully that the dawn after ruin was not an end, it was a quiet, unyielding testament to the slow unraveling of a life, once carefully controlled, now forever altered by shadows, secrecy, and the merciless sweetness of ether.